The dress was the first lie. White silk clung to me as I crossed the moonlit clearing, smooth and cool against skin that felt too hot. Silver thread shimmered along the hem with every step, catching the light in tiny flashes. I had sewn those stitches myself over 6 long months, bent over the fabric after exhausting shifts in the infirmary, my fingers aching, my eyes burning, my heart foolishly certain. Every thread had been a prayer. Every pattern had been a promise. Tonight, the Bloodclaw pack would stand beneath the full moon and witness what the goddess had written into my soul. Tonight, Ryan would claim me. My alpha. My mate. The boy I had loved before he became powerful enough for the whole world to fear. I stopped near the edge of the ancient stone circle and tried to steady my breathing. My heartbeat tapped hard and quick behind my ribs. All around me, hundreds of wolves filled the clearing, their scents blending with pine, damp soil, crushed grass, and the cold bite of night. It should have felt like celebration. It did not. The air was too tight. Too quiet. People shifted away as I passed. Warriors I had patched up after border raids looked down at their boots. Elders whose fevers I had broken, whose old injuries I had treated with herbs and patient hands, suddenly found the trees fascinating. Whispers curled behind palms and vanished the moment I turned my head. No one wanted to look at me. That should have warned me. Claire, someone murmured. I turned and found old Nessa beside me. She was one of the few Omegas who had never treated my kindness as weakness. Her hands, rough with age, came up to smooth a wrinkle near my sleeve. You look lovely, she said. Her mouth smiled. Her eyes did not. There was pity in them, thick and suffocating, and it slid cold into my stomach. I looked away before I had to understand it. Not tonight, I told myself. Not after 6 years. 6 years of standing quietly behind Ryan while he clawed his way into greatness. 6 years of keeping his home warm, his wounds clean, his secrets buried. 6 years of being the Omega no one praised, the girl in the corner, the hand that steadied him when no one else saw him bleed. I had accepted the shadows because I believed I belonged to him there. The bond had never been completed, but it had always lived between us. A faint golden pulse at the back of my mind. A quiet thread pulling me toward him no matter how far he stood from me. The murmuring crowd fell silent. Power rolled through the clearing. My skin prickled. Ryan had arrived. He stepped from the tree line as if the night itself had opened for him. Broad shoulders. Dark hair pushed back from his face. Amber eyes glowing beneath the moon with the cold intensity that made warriors lower their heads. He looked every inch the alpha Bloodclaw had bled to create. Every inch the king I had helped build. My breath caught. My mate. My future. But he did not search the Omega side of the clearing. He did not look for me. His gaze stayed forward, hard and distant, fixed on the stone platform at the center of the circle. I felt the first real crack of fear. Ryan reached the base of the steps and stopped. Then he extended one hand behind him, into the shadow of the trees. A woman came forward. The clearing seemed to draw breath around her. Sarah of Northreach walked into the moonlight wrapped in silver silk that moved like water over her body. She was beautiful in a sharp, polished way, chin lifted, spine straight, every step declaring that the world had already made room for her. Her scent cut through the forest air, bright jasmine with a bite underneath, bold enough to claim space before she ever said a word. Beside her, my hand-stitched dress suddenly felt cheap. Ryan took her hand. No, he did more than that. He threaded his fingers through hers and held on where everyone could see. It was a simple gesture. A public one. Intimate in a way he had never allowed himself to be with me, not in front of the pack, not in private where anyone might walk in. They climbed the stone steps together. Cold spread through me slowly at first, then all at once. The head elder lifted his staff. His voice carried over the clearing and struck the stones with ritual weight. Members of the Bloodclaw pack, the moon is full, and the hour of claiming has come. Alpha Ryan, name the woman you choose to stand beside you as Luna. This was where the world was supposed to correct itself. This was where the bond was supposed to rise, undeniable and sacred, and pull his eyes to mine. I stepped out of the shadows. Only one step, but it felt like walking off a ledge. Moonlight fell over my white dress. My hands trembled at my sides as I stared up at him. Look at me, Ryan. Remember who held you together when you were bleeding on the infirmary floor. Remember the winter nights when we were young and hungry and you swore I would never be nothing to you? Remember me?" Ryan turned. His amber eyes met mine across the gathered pack. For one breath, everything stopped. Something moved in his expression. Recognition. Pain. Guilt, maybe. The ghost of the boy who had once pressed his forehead to mine and promised that power would never change what we were. Then it disappeared. His face closed. The alpha remained. He looked away from me and toward Sarah. Toward her father's 3,000 warriors. Toward the alliances, the armies, the bloodline, the safety she could bring to the empire he had spent years building. When he faced the pack again, his voice held no softness at all. "For the strength of our bloodline, for the security of our warriors, and for the glory of Bloodclaw, I choose Sarah of Northreach." The ground seemed to tilt under my feet. The crowd erupted, but the sound reached me from very far away. My lungs emptied. Pain opened beneath my ribs, clean and cold and deep enough to swallow every breath I tried to take. The elder spoke again, quieter now, though the old law forced the question from him. "And what of Claire?" he asked. "The ancient rites recorded her as your fated mate." Ryan did not hesitate. He did not even flinch. From the platform, he looked down at me as though I were a problem already solved. "Claire belongs to the past," he said. "A mistake made before I understood what this pack required. A shadow cannot lead." Silence fell. He drew in a breath, and I knew before he spoke that the words would ruin me. I, Ryan of the Bloodclaw pack, formally reject Claire as my mate and Luna. The bond broke. Not gently. Not like thread slipping loose. It tore through me. The golden tether that had lived inside my mind for 6 years snapped with a force that drove the air from my body. Agony slammed into my chest, bright and savage, as if someone had hooked a blade beneath my ribs and dragged it through everything that made me whole. I fell. My knees struck the frozen ground. Mud and crushed leaves stained the white silk I had spent half a year making beautiful. My hands hit the earth, but I barely felt it. All I could feel was the empty place where the bond had been, burning black and raw inside me. The pack began to cheer. Not for me. Never for me. They cheered for their new Luna. Through the blur of pain, I saw Sarah lean close to Ryan and press her mouth to his cheek. A claiming kiss. A victory shone sweetly enough for the crowd to bless. When she pulled back, her eyes found mine over his shoulder. She smiled. It was not joy. It was triumph sharpened into cruelty. She wanted me to know she had taken everything. The crowd parted as Ryan came down the steps. His boots crushed frost and grass beneath him until he stopped directly in front of me. His shadow covered my ruined dress, my shaking hands, my bent body. I forced myself to lift my head. There was no love in his face. No hatred either. Only distance. Cold pity. The kind a man might feel for something wounded on the road before deciding whether it was kinder to leave it there. "Do you accept the rejection, Claire?" he asked. His alpha command pressed into my bones, heavy and absolute, demanding obedience even now, even while my soul lay torn open at his feet. I tasted blood. I had bitten my tongue to keep from screaming. Ryan crouched slightly, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "Accept it," he said. "Do that, and I may persuade Sarah to let you remain in the servants' quarters. You can keep your place in the infirmary. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." For a moment, I could only stare at him. Servants' quarters. The infirmary. Scraps of mercy from the man who had just severed my future in front of the entire pack. Pain roared through me until the clearing blurred at the edges. My broken heart beat against emptiness. My wolf whimpered somewhere deep inside, stunned and bleeding from a loss neither of us had chosen. But beneath the grief, something stirred. It was faint at first. Then warmer. Older. It rose from a place in my blood I had never touched, something buried so deep that the bond must have been holding it down all along. The moment Ryan cut me loose, whatever had slept there opened its eyes. I drew in a slow breath. The winter air burned my lungs. I did not reach for him. I did not beg. I did not offer him the satisfaction of seeing me crawl. I looked up at the alpha who had mistaken my silence for weakness and gave him the words he wanted in a voice he did not expect. "I accept your rejection, Alpha Ryan." The cheering died as if someone had cut its throat. Ryan's eyes narrowed. He had expected tears. A plea. Maybe my hands clutching at his boots while I begged him to remember what we had been. I gave him none of it. I rose slowly from the mud, my ruined dress heavy around my legs, my chest still aching around the hollow where our bond used to live. Then I held his gaze and finished what he had started. And may the moon goddess have mercy on what you chose instead. And may the moon goddess have mercy on what you have chosen in my place. The words left my lips, steady and cold, carrying a quiet conviction that echoed in the sudden, suffocating silence of the clearing. For a fraction of a second, surprise flashed across Ryan's amber eyes. It wasn't the reaction he had anticipated. He had expected tears. He had expected me to throw myself at the base of the stone platform, clawing at the dirt, begging him to reconsider. He had expected the weak, submissive Omega he had always believed me to be. Instead, I gave him my absolute, unwavering acceptance of his betrayal. But words of defiance, no matter how strongly spoken, could not stop the brutal, physical reality of what had just been done. The severing of a mate bond wasn't just a legal decree. It was a tearing of the soul. The invisible, golden thread that had hummed between my heart and Ryan's for the past 6 years, the thread that allowed me to feel his triumphs, his angers, and his presence even when he was miles away, ignited into a line of pure, white-hot fire. My knees gave out. I hit the frozen ground so hard the impact rattled my teeth, but that pain was nothing compared to the inferno consuming my chest. It felt as if a jagged, rusted hook had been driven through my ribs, snagging the deepest part of my essence, and violently ripped outward. I clamped my hands over my chest, doubling over as a raw, guttural gasp tore from my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the urge to scream. Don't let them hear you break. Don't give him that satisfaction. Around me, the clearing erupted into chaos, though it sounded muted, as if I were underwater. Did you see her face? A voice hissed from the crowd. It belonged to Clara, an elite warrior whose broken arm I had painstakingly reset just 3 moons ago. The audacity to speak to the Alpha like that. She is just an Omega, another voice sneered, thick with contempt. What did she expect? That the Alpha of Bloodclaw would actually bind himself to a healer who flinches at thunder? She should be grateful he kept her around this long. Their words were like salt rubbed into my bleeding soul. I had spent 6 years in the infirmary, my hands stained with their blood, using every ounce of my herbal knowledge to pull them back from the brink of death after brutal border skirmishes. I had kept their secrets. I had comforted their mates. Now, they looked at me as if I were a diseased stray that had dared to track mud into their immaculate pack house. The pack bond, the communal tether that connected every member of Bloodclaw, began to actively reject me. It was a secondary agony to the broken mate bond. The collective warmth of the pack, the shared sense of belonging and protection, receded from my mind like a retreating tide, leaving behind a cold, terrifying void. I was being exiled in real time, my spirit pushed out into the frozen dark. Above me, on the raised stone platform, Ryan stood immovable. He didn't reach out. He didn't order the crowd to be silent. His alpha command, a heavy, oppressive weight that usually settled over the pack to demand order, was completely absent. He was letting them tear me down. Alpha Ryan, a smooth, silken voice cut through the murmurs. Sarah. She stepped forward, her shimmering silver dress catching the moonlight. The jasmine scent of her perfume rolled over the crowd, sharp and cloying, completely masking the familiar pine and damp earth of the Bloodclaw territory. She looked down at me, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawn together in a mask of pristine, manufactured concern. The poor thing is in agony, Sarah said, her voice dripping with a pity that felt far more venomous than the pack's outright scorn. She placed a delicate, manicured hand on Ryan's broad chest, a gesture of ownership that made my stomach churn. We must show her grace, my alpha. It is the duty of a strong Luna to care for the weakest of her pack. Ryan covered her hand with his gaze softening marginally as he looked at her. You are too kind, Sarah. More merciful than she deserves after her insolence. Sarah turned her gaze back to me. Claire, she cooed, taking half a step down the stairs, making sure the entire pack could hear her benevolence. You have served Bloodclaw well in the infirmary. I see no reason why you should be cast out into the cold. I will speak to the head Omegas. We can arrange a cot for you in the servants' quarters, near the kitchens. You can continue to roll bandages and brew potions. You will be safe under our protection. The crowd murmured in agreement, praising the new Luna's endless generosity. My breath hitched, the taste of copper flooding my mouth as I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek to keep from vomiting. Mercy. They called it mercy. But I knew exactly what it was. It was a collar. Sarah didn't want to save me. She wanted to keep the former mate close, reduced to a scrubbing maid, a daily, living monument to her victory and my ultimate defeat. She wanted me to spend the rest of my life walking the halls of the pack house with my head bowed, fetching water for the alpha who had shattered my soul, and washing the bedsheets they would sleep on. And Ryan? Ryan thought this was a brilliant solution. You hear that, Claire? Ryan's voice boomed, vibrating with absolute authority. The Luna has offered you a place. Accept it, and your basic needs will be met. You will remain within the boundary protections. It is a far better fate than a rogue Omega could hope for in the borderlands. He genuinely believed he was doing me a favor. He believed that my entire existence depended on his scraps. A strange, icy calm began to spread outward from the jagged hole in my chest. The agonizing pain was still there, throbbing with every beat of my heart, but it was suddenly eclipsed by something else. Clarity. For 6 years, I had believed that my worth was tied to Ryan's approval. I had believed that if I was quiet enough, helpful enough, and loving enough, the moon goddess would reward my devotion. But looking at Ryan now standing tall beside a woman he chose for power, looking down at me as a problem to be managed, I realized the horrifying truth. He had never loved me. I had just been convenient. I placed my hands flat against the freezing mud. My arms trembled violently under the strain, my muscles screaming in protest as the broken bond tried to drag me back down into submission. But I pushed. Slowly, agonizingly, I pushed myself up. My white silk dress, the one I had poured months of hope into, was ruined, stained with dirt and the faint smears of my own blood where I had scraped my hands. My hair hung in tangled, sweaty curtains around my pale face. I didn't brush it away. I didn't try to look presentable. I stood up, straightening my spine until I was standing as tall as my small frame allowed. The murmurs in the crowd died down. The sight of a rejected Omega standing up without permission, defying the crushing weight of an Alpha's presence, was unheard of. I looked directly into Ryan's amber eyes. I didn't see my childhood love anymore. I just saw a stranger wearing a crown. No, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the clearing, it carried like the crack of a whip. Ryan's jaw tightened, a dangerous growl vibrating in his chest. Excuse me? I said no, Alpha Ryan, I repeated, my voice steadying, drawing strength from a deep, ancient well inside me that I didn't fully understand. I do not accept your Luna's mercy. And I do not accept a cot in your servant's quarters. Sarah let out a soft, theatrical gasp, taking a step back as if my words had physically struck her. Claire, be reasonable. You are an Omega. You have no pack to return to. If you leave Bloodclaw, you will be rogue. You will be hunted. You won't last a week in the wild. Better to be hunted by wolves in the wild, I said, my gaze shifting to Sarah, stripping away her mask of pity to reveal the calculated cruelty underneath, than to be kept as a pet by monsters in a palace. Several warriors snarled at the insult, taking a step forward, their eyes flashing yellow. But Ryan raised a hand, stopping them. His eyes were narrowed, locked onto mine, trying to read a bluff that wasn't there. You are acting out of pride, Claire, Ryan said coldly, his alpha aura pressing down on me, trying to force my knees to buckle. Pride will not keep you warm when the blizzards hit. Pride will not protect you from the ferals that roam the borderlands. Accept the offer. Do not force me to banish you. The heavy, suffocating weight of his alpha command pushed against my mind, a blunt instrument demanding submission. A week ago, it would have worked. A week ago, I would have lowered my eyes and bared my throat. But the bond was broken. And with its breaking, the chains of my blind devotion had shattered. I met his alpha command with a cold, impenetrable wall of sheer will. I didn't flinch. I didn't bow. You cannot banish someone who is already leaving, I stated, my voice ringing with a strange, harmonic resonance that made a few of the older wolves in the front row twitch nervously. I demand the severing documents. Drawn up immediately. Signed by your hand and the elders, witnessed by the pack. A complete, irrevocable break. Legal and spiritual. Ryan stared at me, a muscle feathering in his jaw. For a brief, fleeting moment, I saw a flash of something in his eyes. Not regret. a sharp, sudden unease. He was looking at a woman he realized he didn't know at all. "You are a fool," Ryan finally growled, his voice dropping to a lethal timbre. "If that is what you want, Omega, you shall have it. But know this, once those papers are signed, you are dead to Bloodclaw. When the winter breaks you, when you are starving and freezing at our borders, do not expect the gates to open." "I want tea," I replied, my gaze unyielding. "Because I will never look back." I waited only long enough for the elder to bring the parchment. Long enough to sign my name in blood. Not long enough to watch Sarah smile from Ryan's side. The crowd parted for me as I turned to leave. Not out of respect, but out of the superstitious fear of a broken Omega walking willingly toward her own grave. As I walked away from the moonlit clearing, the icy wind biting through my ruined dress, the agony in my chest began to shift. The raw, bleeding wound of the severed bond remained, but something new was taking root in the empty space it left behind. It wasn't love. It wasn't loyalty. It was a cold, terrifying freedom. The severance documents felt like a weight of lead in my hand, yet they were the only things that made me feel remotely tethered to reality. The heavy parchment was scratched with archaic runes, legalizing my exile and severing any remaining spiritual ties to the Bloodclaw pack. I had signed them with a hand that didn't shake, using a quill dipped in my own blood, as tradition demanded. I hadn't looked at Ryan when I handed them back to the elder. I hadn't needed to. I could feel his amber gaze burning into the side of my face, a heavy, oppressive stare from a man who looked at me as if I were a stranger who had just insulted him. I didn't wait for the ceremony to officially end. I didn't wait for the feast, the roasted meats, or the howling that would inevitably follow the claiming of a new Luna. I turned my back on the raised stone platform and walked away from the moonlit clearing, my ruined white dress dragging heavily through the mud and dead leaves. I felt like a ghost walking among the living. The path back to my small hut on the outskirts of the pack territory was long, winding, and agonizingly lonely. For years, this forest had felt like a protective embrace. I knew every ancient pine, every hidden stream, every patch of healing moss. But tonight, the woods felt cold, alien, and deeply indifferent to my suffering. The mate bond was gone, and with it went the shared sensory connection that had allowed me to feel the pack's pulse. The comforting, low-level hum of hundreds of wolves moving in harmony, a sensation I hadn't fully appreciated until it was violently ripped away, was replaced by a deafening, terrifying silence. It was as if I had gone deaf in my soul. I was truly alone. I finally reached my hut. It was a humble structure of rough-hewn wood and fieldstone, nestled tightly against the tree-line, far away from the grandeur of the pack house. I had spent countless hours tending to it, planting herbs near the window, sweeping the uneven floorboards, trying to make it a home. Now, looking at its dark, unlit windows, I realized it had never been a home. It had just been a cage with an open door that I had been too terrified to walk through. Until tonight. I pushed the wooden door open. The hinges whined softly, a familiar sound that usually brought me comfort. Tonight, it sounded like a dying breath. I moved through the small, moonlit room with a clinical, almost robotic detachment. I needed to pack. I needed to move before the shock wore off and the true magnitude of my physical pain set in. My eyes fell on the things Ryan had given me over the years. They were scattered around the room like mocking little monuments to a love that had never existed. There were the soft, heavy wool blankets piled on the narrow bed, given to me during the brutal winter when I had almost frozen in this drafty shack. There were the fine, shimmering silk dresses hung carefully in the small wardrobe dresses he insisted I wear to formal dinners so I wouldn't embarrass him, though he rarely looked at me when I wore them. On the small wooden table sat a collection of delicate silver hairpins, a gift for my 20th birthday that he had tossed onto the table without a word before leaving for a border patrol. I stared at the silver pins, the moonlight reflecting off their polished surfaces. I reached out, my fingertips hovering just millimeters above the cold metal. For 6 years, I had cherished these breadcrumbs of affection. I had woven stories around them, convincing myself that his distance was just the heavy burden of an alpha, and that these sporadic gifts were his silent way of saying he loved me. Fool, I whispered into the empty room. I dropped my hand. I didn't touch the pins. I didn't touch the silk dresses. I didn't touch the wool blankets. They weren't gifts of love. They were the gilding on a cage. They were the cheap currency he used to buy my silent obedience. I stripped off the ruined white dress, the dress I had spent 6 months embroidering, each silver thread a prayer to the moon goddess for a future that was never meant to be. I balled it up, the silk heavy with mud and my own dried blood, and threw it onto the cold, dead ashes of the hearth. In its place, I pulled on my oldest, sturdiest traveling leathers. The leather was worn soft at the elbows and knees, the stitching frayed in places. I had bought these clothes with my own meager earnings from trading poultices and salves in the neutral trading posts. They weren't beautiful. But they were thick, warm, and, most importantly, they belonged entirely to me. I laced up a pair of heavy, knee-high hunting boots and strapped a simple leather belt around my waist, slipping a hunting dagger into the sheath. I took nothing that smelled of Ryan. Nothing that belonged to Bloodclaw. If I was going to die in the Borderlands, I would die as Claire, not as a discarded piece of Bloodclaw property. My packing was brief. I grabbed my worn canvas satchel and moved to my small, meticulously organized herb station. I loaded the satchel with dried yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for pain, and a small jar of potent moonflower paste for infection. These were my real weapons. Before I turned to leave, I went straight to the far corner of the small room, near the cold hearth. I knelt on the uneven floorboards, the rough wood biting into my knees. I dug my fingernails into a small crack between the planks and pried up a loose floorboard, reaching my arm deep into the dark, cool earth beneath the foundation. My fingers brushed against something hard and wooden. I pulled it out, blowing off a thick layer of dust. It was a small, unassuming wooden box, blackened by age and dampness. Its hinges were rusted shut, and it looked like something you might find discarded in a rubbish heap. But to me, it was the only thing of true value in this entire territory. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of moth-eaten, deep purple velvet, was the only thing my mother had left me before she disappeared into the mists of the Borderlands when I was just a child. The signet ring. I unwrapped it carefully. It was a heavy, incredibly ugly piece of jewelry. The metal was a blackened, tarnished silver that looked more like cheap iron. The face of the ring was completely smooth, devoid of any crest or marking, as if it had been intentionally melted down to hide its origin. To any member of Bloodclaw, it was junk. Ryan had seen it once, laughed, and told me to throw it away before it turned my finger green. But as my bare skin touched the cold metal, a sharp, crystalline hum vibrated in the marrow of my bones. It wasn't the warm, suffocating blanket of a pack bond. It was something vastly different. Something older. Something that tasted of deep earth, hidden caves, and ancient moonlight. I slipped the ring onto my right ring finger. It was designed for a man's hand, far too large for my slender fingers. But as it slid past my knuckle, a strange thing happened. The metal seemed to warm, constricting almost imperceptibly until it clamped perfectly around my finger, tight and immovable. A sudden, breathtaking rush of cold clarity washed over my mind, instantly numbing the jagged, bleeding hole in my chest where Ryan's bond had been. The physical pain of the severance was still there, but the emotional panic, the crushing fear of being unmated and alone evaporated. "Time to go," I whispered, the sound of my own voice startling me in the quiet room. I moved back to the herb station. I took a handful of cinder root and ghost leaf bitter, highly toxic herbs that smelled like ash and rotting wood. Even a trained tracker wolf's sensitive nose struggled to pick up a scent through the overwhelming stench of these plants. I crushed the dry leaves into a coarse paste using my mortar and pestle, adding a few drops of water. I smeared the dark, gritty mixture over my pulse points, the sides of my neck, my wrists, behind my knees, and around my ankles. The smell was revolting, making my eyes water, but it would mask my natural omega scent for a few hours. Long enough to reach the neutral zone of the Borderlands. I slung the satchel over my shoulder. I packed a half-filled water skin, a few pieces of hard bread, and some dried meat. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me alive for a few days if I was careful. I needed to travel light and fast. I stood in the doorway, taking one last look at the hut. I had spent 6 years waiting for Ryan here. 6 years believing that if I was just patient enough, my life would begin. I didn't blow out a candle, because there was no light left to extinguish. I simply stepped out into the freezing night and pulled the door shut behind me. It closed with a soft, final click. The journey to the northern border was a grueling test of endurance. I avoided the main patrol routes, sticking to the dense, thorny underbrush where the shadows were thickest. The icy wind howled through the skeletal branches of the pines, biting through my leathers, chilling me to the bone. Every step sent a jolt of pain radiating from my chest, but I gritted my teeth and kept moving, driven by a raw, primal instinct to survive. The borderlands were a place of myth, nightmare, and death. It was a jagged, unforgiving scar of territory stretching across the continent, where the land was too unstable, too resource-poor, and too violent for any single pack to claim. It was the dumping ground for the unwanted. The home of exiled rogues, the mad, the feral, and the forgotten. It was a death sentence for a lone Omega. The wind escalated into a shrieking gale as I neared the boundary line. The geography shifted abruptly here. The lush, managed pine forests of Bloodclaw gave way to twisted, blackened, ancient trees that looked like reaching, skeletal hands. The air smelled different, sharper, metallic, heavy with ozone and the scent of pulverized stone. I reached the first boundary marker, a massive, petrified oak tree scarred with the deep, violent claw marks of a dozen different alphas who had claimed and lost this edge of the world over the centuries. I stopped. I turned and looked back south one last time. Through the dense trees and the swirling snow, I could see the faint, warm glow of the pack house perched on the distant hill. It looked like a beacon of warmth, safety, and community. A life that had never truly wanted me. A life I was finally walking away from. Ryan thought I was leaving with nothing. He thought I was a broken, pathetic Omega wandering out into the dark, snowy woods to die quietly so he wouldn't have to deal with the guilt of killing me himself. He didn't know that the ugly, tarnished ring on my finger was already beginning to wake up. I turned back to the dark, howling expanse of the borderlands, pulled my leather collar up against the wind, and stepped over the boundary line. The moment the sole of my boot touched the frozen, unclaimed soil of the borderlands, the sky seemed to violently darken. A shockwave, silent but physically jarring, rippled up my leg. On my right hand, the signet ring pulsed. Once. Twice. It wasn't a reflection of the moonlight. It was emitting its own steady, vengeful, silver glow, bright enough to cast long, distorted shadows against the snow. My vision blurred. The dark, twisted forest around me seemed to shift, replaced by a sudden, breathtaking pull. For a heartbeat, I wasn't standing in a blizzard. I felt as if I were being drawn towards something vast and ancient, hidden deep beneath the earth. A flash of white stone. A hum of power so intense it made my ears ring. I gasped, stumbling forward, falling to my hands and knees in the snow as the sensation vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The freezing wind howled, bringing me back to the brutal reality of the borderlands. But the hum in my bones didn't fade. It intensified into a low, vibrating roar that resonated with the beating of my heart. I looked down at the ring on my trembling hand. The silver light was dimming, but the connection was undeniable. I didn't know what this ancient power was, or why it had chosen this exact moment, on this exact boundary line, to wake from its decades of slumber. I only knew that I wasn't just a discarded Omega in exile anymore. Something ancient, something hidden deep in the dark earth of the borderlands, knew my name. And it was calling me home. Ryan woke with a start, his hand instinctively reaching for the other side of the bed. The silk sheets were cold. Smooth. Empty. He blinked against the harsh morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Alpha S suite. For one confusing, half-conscious second, his mind searched for a familiar scent, the soft, calming aroma of dried lavender and wild honey that had permeated his room for the last 6 years. But it was gone. In its place was the sharp, aggressive jasmine of Sarah's perfume, clinging to the heavy velvet curtains and thick rugs like a suffocating shroud. Sarah herself was already up, likely conferring with her handmaidens or the Pack's decorators about the upcoming coronation gala. Ryan sat up, a low growl vibrating in the back of his throat. A dull, throbbing ache resided deep within his chest, right behind his sternum. It wasn't a physical injury, but a phantom pain, the jagged, raw edges of the mate bond he had severed the night before. Mistake, his wolf whispered, a low, ominous sound in the back of his mind. Silence, Ryan muttered, rubbing his face with his hands. His wolf had been restless since the ceremony. Usually, the beast was a silent, lethal passenger, subservient to Ryan's alpha will. But this morning, it was pacing the cage of his mind, its hackles raised, its amber eyes fixed on the empty space beside the bed. It felt as if a limb had been amputated, leaving behind a terrifying, phantom itch that couldn't be scratched. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling, prosperous territory of the Bloodclaw pack. He had done what was necessary. He had chosen power. He had chosen Sarah, whose father controlled the northern shipping lanes and commanded 3,000 seasoned warriors. With Sarah as his Luna, Bloodclaw would become the dominant force in the hemisphere. Claire was She was just Claire. A mistake of his youth. A girl who had comforted him when he was a boy, but who had no place in the world of kings and conquerors. She was an omega, physically weak, politically useless, and far too soft for the brutal realities of ruling. She saved you, his wolf growled. She healed the wounds that should have killed us. She was the anchor. She was a placeholder, Ryan countered, his voice cold and certain. She was the shadow I needed while I built the light. Now the light is here. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his internal argument. Enter, Ryan commanded, his alpha voice instantly snapping into place, heavy and demanding. Commander Vance stepped inside, his expression uncharacteristically grim. Vance was Ryan's oldest friend and his most trusted advisor, a man who had survived 100 battles. He rarely looked this unsettled. Alpha, Vance said, bowing his head. Report, Ryan said, moving to his dressing table and pulling on a charcoal gray silk shirt. Has the Northreach delegation finalized the trade tariffs? Not yet, Alpha. Alpha Garrick is negotiating. He knows we need his warriors for the winter border push. Vance hesitated, his gaze shifting to the floor. But that isn't why I'm here. Ryan paused, one hand on his silver cufflinks. What is it? It's Claire, Alpha. Vance's voice dropped. She's gone. Ryan didn't flinch. He didn't even turn around. Of course she's gone. I rejected her. I expected her to move her things to the servants' quarters last night. She didn't go to the servants' quarters, Alpha, Vance said. She left the territory. Entirely. The border guards reported a single figure crossing the northern boundary line just before dawn. The scent trail was masked with cinder root, but the tracker dogs identified the signature. He paused. It was her. Ryan froze. The silver cufflink slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the polished marble floor. She went toward the borderlands? Ryan asked, his voice low and dangerous. Alone? In a dress? She went back to her hut first. We found her ceremonial dress in the hearth. Burned. She took her traveling leathers, a basic medical kit, and almost nothing else. Vance looked up, his eyes filled with a concern he couldn't hide. No horse. No escort. No winter cloak. Almost no supplies. Ryan, the blizzards are coming in. There are rogues on the other side of that line. She won't survive the night. Ryan felt a sudden, sharp spike of irritation. It wasn't fear. He refused to let it be fear. It was a profound, stinging annoyance. How dare she? How dare she reject the mercy he had so graciously offered? How dare she throw a tantrum and walk into the wild, making him look like a monster in front of his elders? She is throwing a fit, Ryan said, finally turning to face Vance, his expression a mask of cold arrogance. She is trying to make me feel guilty. She thinks that by putting herself in danger, I'll go running after her like a lovesick pup. Ryan, she was bleeding from the severance, Vance reminded him. The pain alone should have incapacitated her. The fact that she walked 5 miles to the border it shouldn't be possible. She has always been stubborn, Ryan snapped. But stubbornness won't kill a feral. He walked back to the window, staring toward the jagged, gray mountains of the north. She'll realize her mistake soon enough. The borderlands aren't a storybook. Once the hunger sets in, once the first rogue tries to take a bite out of her, she'll come crawling back. His jaw tightened. She has no skills. No pack. No mate. Ryan looked toward the north. Give her 3 days. 3 days of cold and fear, and she'll be scratching at the gates, begging Sarah for that cot in the kitchen. Don't send a search party. Don't waste the resources. She chose this. Vance opened his mouth as if to argue, but the look on Ryan's face silenced him. As you wish, Alpha. Was there anything else? Ryan asked, dismissal clear in his tone. Actually, yes. There is a problem at the vaults. Ryan frowned. The vaults? The Moonstone Reserves? The Master of Coin is waiting in the war room. It seems, there's a discrepancy. A significant one. Ryan felt a cold prickle of unease. He finished dressing and strode down the long, echoing hallways of the pack house. Everywhere he went, warriors bowed, but the atmosphere was brittle. The morning after a Luna ceremony should have been filled with celebration. But today, there was a strange, heavy tension in the air. He entered the war room, where the master of coin, an elderly, nervous beta named Corin, was frantically shuffling through thick ledgers. Alpha, Corin squeaked, bowing low. Thank you for coming. What is the meaning of this, Corin? Ryan demanded, taking his seat at the head of the massive obsidian table. Vance says their essay discrepancy. It's the moonstone supply, Alpha. The refined stones we use to stabilize the pack bond and power the boundary wards. Corin's trembling finger pointed to a line on the ledger. Our records indicated we had enough reserves to last through the next 3 winters. But when the quartermasters went to the vault this morning to prepare the monthly distribution for the warriors. Speak up, man, Ryan growled. The high-grade reserves are lower than the records claim, Alpha, Corin whispered, sweating profusely. Not gone. Not yet. But low enough to make every winter projection unreliable. And the discrepancies, they only appeared when we did the physical count this morning. Ryan slammed his fist onto the obsidian table. The stone cracked under the force of his blow. Are you telling me someone stole them? Ryan roared. Under my nose? We don't know, Alpha. Corin cried, nearly falling out of his chair. The ledgers look perfect on the surface, but the math doesn't add up. And the northern vein, our primary source, is reporting a sudden drop in quality. The latest samples are increasingly unstable. Ryan stared at the ledger, his jaw tight. The timing was a jagged splinter in his mind. Claire had spent half her life in that infirmary, surrounded by the very stones that were now failing. Where's the new shipment? Ryan asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The one from Northreach? Sarah's father promised 1,000 stones as part of the dowry. Vance stepped forward, his face grim. The caravan has been delayed, Alpha. We just got word from the scouts. The northern pass is slow going due to the early snows. The stones won't arrive for at least another week. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the room. Without moonstones, the pack bond would eventually begin to fray. It wasn't an immediate collapse. But the anchor was weakening. The border veins, Ryan said, his voice tight. We have the secondary mines on the northern edge. There's a blockage in the main tunnel, Alpha, Corin said, his voice trembling. And the yield from the northern edge has plummeted. The stone is brittle, almost inert. Ryan looked at his hands. He could feel the ache in his chest intensifying. It wasn't just the phantom pain of the broken bond anymore. It was the first, faint tremor of a pack-wide instability. He had chosen Sarah for her power. He had chosen the Northreach alliance to secure his future. But as he looked at the reports of unstable veins and missing counts, a cold, terrifying thought flickered in the back of his mind. The thought was absurd. Insulting. Claire had been a healer, nothing more. She could not have anything to do with unstable veins or record discrepancies. This was sabotage. Or simply a run of bad luck. Find her, his wolf roared, the sound so loud it made his vision swim. Find the mate. No, Ryan whispered, his jaw set in a hard, stubborn line. She is an Omega. She has no power over the earth. This is a coincidence. Sabotage by our enemies. Sarah will handle it. Northreach will provide. He stood up, his alpha presence radiating a forced, brittle confidence. Double the patrols. Tell Garrick to clear the pass by any means necessary. And as for Claire. He looked toward the northern windows, where the first flakes of a massive blizzard were beginning to fall. Give her 3 days, he repeated, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. By the time the snow clears, she'll be begging to come home. And then she'll tell us exactly what she knows about the missing stones. He turned and strode out of the room, ignoring the hollow, echoing silence that followed him. He was the alpha of Bloodclaw. He had made the right choice. He just had to wait for the world to realize it. The borderlands were not merely a territory. They were a living, breathing predator. And I was currently dissolving in its gullet. The wind howled through the skeletal, blackened trees, a mournful, shrieking sound that seemed to echo the jagged void in my chest. My thin traveling leathers, which had felt so sturdy back in the sheltered valleys of Bloodclaw, offered almost no protection against the biting, supernatural frost of the north. Every breath I took felt like inhaling a lungful of jagged glass shards, the cold searing my throat and making my head spin with dangerous, lightheaded exhaustion. I stumbled over a thick, frozen root that looked like a petrified snake, my knees hitting the iron-hard earth with a bone-jarring thud. I didn't want to get up. The snow was beginning to pile up around me, a soft, white shroud that promised a painless, numbing end. My body was shutting down, the adrenaline of my escape finally curdling into a heavy, leaden fatigue that made my eyelids feel like they weighed 100 pounds. Hell. The sound was distant, but it made every hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't the rhythmic, structured call of a pack patrol, nor was it the lonely cry of a rogue seeking a mate. It was a jagged, wet, discordant sound, a scream of pure, unadulterated madness. The scent hit me a second later, carried on a sharp gust of wind. It smelled of rotting iron, old blood, and the sickly sweet stench of a mind that had entirely snapped. Ferals. Wolves who had lost their humanity to the madness of the borderlands, their souls eroded by a rot I didn't understand, leaving behind nothing but a hunger that could never be sated. I forced myself to my feet, my muscles screaming in a chorus of agony. I didn't know how many there were, but the sound was getting closer, the crunch of heavy paws on frozen snow echoing through the trees. I was an omega, weakened by a severed bond and half frozen. I couldn't outrun them. I couldn't outfight them. Suddenly, my right hand flared with a sudden, blinding heat. The signet ring. The silver light was no longer a faint, rhythmic pulse. It was a steady, brilliant glow that cut through the swirling white out of the blizzard like a lighthouse beam. It felt like a warm hearth had been placed directly against my skin. The hum in my bones grew louder, a deep, vibrating frequency that seemed to synchronize with the frantic thumping of my heart. This way. The command wasn't a voice in my head. It was a physical pull in my blood, an invisible tether dragging me toward the sheer, icy cliffs that loomed to the west. I scrambled up a steep, treacherous slope, my fingers numbing as I clawed at frozen rocks and patches of black ice. Behind me, the howls were louder now, accompanied by the sound of snapping branches and heavy, labored breathing. They were close. I could smell the copper tang of their desperation. At the summit of the slope, I found myself facing a massive, sheer cliff face. Its surface was covered in a prehistoric layer of ice, thick and translucent, reflecting the vengeful silver glow of my ring. The ring was burning now, the heat almost unbearable. I reached out, my hand trembling with exhaustion and terror, and pressed the blackened metal of the ring against a small, circular indentation in the center of the stone, a mark I hadn't even noticed until the ring pointed it out. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The wind shrieked, and I heard the first feral break through the tree line at the bottom of the slope, its eyes glowing a sickly, diseased yellow. Then, the ground beneath my feet vibrated. A low, grinding sound, like the shifting of tectonic plates, filled the air. The massive stone wall, which had looked like a solid piece of the mountain for 10,000 years, slowly began to split in two. A gust of stale, ancient air rushed out from the darkness within, smelling of dust, cold stone, and something faint. Something that smelled like the first rain of spring after a long drought. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself through the opening just as a massive, fur-covered shape lunged at my heels, its teeth snapping inches from my boot. The stone walls hummed as they slid back together, the heavy thud of the seal cutting off the wind and the frustrated, animalistic shrieks of the ferals. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. I was in a vast, vaulted hall. The ceiling was lost in the deep shadows above, but the walls were lined with massive pillars of white stone that seemed to glow with their own internal, ethereal light. The air here was still, devoid of the biting frost of the outside world. I walked deeper into the hall, my boots echoing loudly against the smooth stone floor. In the center of the chamber sat a raised dais, and upon it, a large, shattered tablet of gray stone. I knelt before the tablet, my breath hitching in my chest. The ancient script was worn by time, but as the light from my ring hit the surface, the jagged, elegant letters seemed to shimmer into focus. Silver Moon. A sob caught in my throat, a raw, painful sound that bounced off the high ceiling. This was it. The stories my mother had whispered to me in the dark, the ones I had dismissed as fairy tales to comfort a lonely child, were true. This was not a fairy tale. This was proof that my mother had left me more than a ring. I reached out to touch the tablet, my fingers trembling. As my skin brushed the cold stone, the silver light from my ring flowed into the cracks of the tablet like liquid mercury. For a breathtaking moment, the entire hall was filled with a soft, radiant glow, and I felt a surge of power, calm, steady, and ancient ripple through my soul. Crack. The sound of a heavy boot hitting stone shattered the moment. I froze, the blood draining from my face. The sound had come from the entrance. Someone or something had slipped inside before the doors had fully sealed. "I told you I smelled something," a rough, gravelly voice echoed through the hall, dripping with predatory glee. "A fresh omega, out here in the mists. Must be our lucky night, boys." I scrambled behind one of the massive pillars, my hand instinctively going to the small hunting dagger tucked into my belt. I peeked around the edge of the stone, my heart hammering against my ribs. 5 wolves were stalking through the hall. They weren't completely feral yet, but they were close. Their eyes were bloodshot and wild, their postures unnaturally hunched, and the scent of unwashed bodies, cheap ale, and desperation rolled off them in waves. Rogues. Men who had traded their humanity and their pack bonds for the lawless violence of the borderlands. They fanned out, their eyes locked on the spot where I had just been kneeling. "Come out, little bird," the leader sneered, drawing a rusted, notched blade from his belt. He was a massive man with a scarred face and a missing ear. "Soft little thing like you would fetch a fine price at the border pits." My grip on my dagger tightened until my knuckles were white. I was cornered. I was an omega against 5 seasoned killers. But as the leader took a step toward the dais, the air in the sanctuary suddenly changed. The temperature didn't just drop. It plummeted. The ambient silver light of the hall seemed to dim, swallowed by an oppressive, suffocating darkness that bled out from the far corners of the room. A heavy, crushing weight settled over the chamber, an alpha presence so potent, so ancient, and so utterly lethal that it made Ryan's command feel like a child's tantrum. A shadow detached itself from the far wall. It was a man, taller and broader than any wolf I had ever seen, draped in a heavy black cloak that seemed to absorb the very light around him. He didn't rush. He walked with a terrifying, deliberate slowness, his heavy boots making no sound against the stone floor. "The sanctuary is closed," a voice said. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, rumbling baritone that vibrated through the stone floor and into the marrow of my bones. It was the kind of power that made every wolf in the room remember how to fear a king. The rogues stopped in their tracks. The leader dropped his rusted blade, the metal clattering loudly against the stone. His bravado vanished in an instant, replaced by a mask of pure, primal terror. He took a stumbling step backward, his knees shaking, his head bowing instinctively to expose his throat. "Blackwood," the rogue whispered, his voice cracking. We didn't know. We were just." "Leave," the man called Blackwood said, his voice as cold as the ice outside. "Or stay and feed the stones. It makes no difference to me." The rogues didn't wait for a second invitation. They turned and bolted toward the entrance, scrambling over each other in their haste to escape the darkness radiating from the man in the black cloak. I stayed pressed against the pillar, holding my breath, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. The rogue king had arrived. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like the executioner of the borderlands, a man who had carved a kingdom out of nightmare and ash. His golden eyes found me behind the pillar. Not softened. Not curious. Judging. "And you," he said, his voice quieter than the storm outside. "The little thief who opened a dead king's door." The shadows moved with him as he stepped closer. I had escaped one alpha's cage only to find myself in the territory of a king who did not need chains to make wolves obey. The air in the sanctuary didn't just grow cold. It died. I stayed pressed against the massive, glowing stone pillar, my fingers white-knuckled around the hilt of my small hunting dagger. The rogue King Blackwood stood in the center of the vaulted hall, his presence a physical weight that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. The shadows clung to his heavy black cloak like a living shroud, and his golden eyes, sharp and terrifyingly predatory, were fixed unerringly on my hiding spot. "Come out," he said. His voice was a low, resonant vibration that traveled through the ancient stone floor and straight up into my marrow. It wasn't a request. It was a command that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the primal, terrified wolf cowering in the back of my soul. It was a voice used to absolute obedience, forged in a land where hesitation meant death. I took a shaky breath. The air tasted of ancient dust, ozone, and the faint, bitter metallic tang of old magic. I stepped out from behind the pillar. I didn't drop the dagger. I knew it was a pathetic defense against a man who had just sent 5 seasoned rogues fleeing for their lives with a single, softly spoken threat, but the worn leather grip was the only thing anchoring me to reality. It was the only thing that felt like agency. Adrian Blackwood didn't move as I approached. Up close, he was a mountain of a man, easily dwarfing Ryan in sheer, imposing mass. His broad shoulders were draped in a heavy, frost-bitten fur mantle over dark leather armor that looked as if it had seen 100 battles. His face was a harsh landscape of hard angles, pale skin, and cold discipline. A faint, jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow, a testament to a violent past. But it was his eyes that pinned me. They weren't the warm, arrogant amber of a typical pack alpha. They were a deep, molten, unblinking gold, swirling with a focused intensity that felt older than the modern packs, older than the laws of the moon. "The door," he said, his gaze shifting for a fraction of a second to the sealed stone entrance behind me. The massive slabs of rock had closed seamlessly, leaving no trace of a seam. How did an Omega from the southern valleys open a door that has been dead for 3 centuries? "I didn't open it," I said, my voice sounding thin, fragile, and utterly out of place in the vast, echoing hall. "It opened for me." In a blur of motion too fast for my human eyes to track, he was in front of me. A massive, gloved hand shot out, his long fingers locking around my throat. He didn't squeeze. Not yet. But the threat was absolute. He lifted me effortlessly until my heavy hunting boots barely brushed the stone floor, pinning my spine against the cold pillar I had just been hiding behind. My hunting dagger slipped from my numb fingers, clattering uselessly to the floor. "Don't lie to me, little bird," he growled, his face inches from mine. I could smell him now. It wasn't the cloying, perfumed jasmine of Sarah, nor the familiar, arrogant musk of Ryan. He smelled of winter storms, sharp pine, cedarwood, and the harsh, metallic tang of fresh snow on a whetstone. It was the scent of the wild, unfiltered and unforgiving. He leaned in closer, his nose brushing the line of my jaw as he inhaled deeply. I expected him to flinch at my natural Omega scent, to dismiss me as weak. Instead, his golden eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "Cinder root and ghost leaf," he murmured, his voice a low, lethal hum. "You're masked." Heavily. "You've poisoned your own pulse points with a mixture that should be eating through your skin by now. That's not a trick a pampered pack Omega learns in the kitchens. That is tracker evasion." His gaze sharpened. "Who trained you?" "No one," I choked out, my hands instinctively flying up to claw at his wrist. His arm felt like a bar of solid iron. The skin on my wrists was already beginning to blister and throb, a price I'd paid willingly to disappear. I read it. In the old texts. "I'm a healer. I know how to neutralize the worst of the toxin." "You read it," he repeated, his tone dripping with dark, mocking disbelief. "The Silvermoon Sanctuary doesn't open for accidents, Claire of Bloodclaw. It opens for old blood. Or for very specific, very ancient keys." My breath hitched. He knew my name. His gaze dropped to my right hand, hanging limply at my side, where the heavy, tarnished signet ring rested on my finger. The silver glow had died, but in the dim light of the sanctuary, the metal seemed to drink the shadows. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, his grip tightening just enough to restrict the airflow, sending a sharp spike of panic through my chest. "It was my mother's," I wheezed, my nails scraping uselessly against the heavy leather of his bracer. The physical agony of my recently severed mate bond flared, a jagged, burning reminder of the weakness Ryan had condemned me to. But beneath the pain, beneath the bone-deep exhaustion of running through a blizzard, a spark of pure, unadulterated rage ignited. I was tired of being pinned to walls. Tired of being questioned. Tired of being the victim in a world run by arrogant men. "And if you're going to kill me for it, then do it," I forced the words past his suffocating grip, looking directly into those terrifying golden eyes without blinking. "I've already lost everything else. A broken neck would be a mercy compared to what I've just walked away from." Adrian froze. He didn't let go, but the lethal pressure in his fingers stopped increasing. He stared at me, his brow furrowing slightly, as if he were trying to read a language he didn't quite understand. I knew what he was looking for. He was an apex predator. He was looking for the scent of submission, the sharp, sour tang of an Omega begging for her life, exposing her throat, weeping for a second chance. But he didn't find it. Because I had nothing left to lose. He found only a hollow, echoing silence in my scent. A deadness that mirrored the cold stones of the sanctuary around us. "You're a long way from home," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, inquisitive whisper. "I know who you are. I know you're alpha. I know Ryan threw you away last night in front of his entire pack to bed the Northreach princess. Then you know I have no reason to lie for him, I spat, the copper taste of my own blood filling my mouth as I bit down hard on my inner lip to keep my focus. He is nothing to me. Bloodclaw is nothing to me. They are dead to me. Adrian's grip shifted slightly, his thumb pressing against the rapid, frantic pulse at my throat. Is that why you're here? To bring the Rogue King a gift? A key to the ancient border veins in exchange for an army to march south? Did Ryan send you here to infiltrate my territory, playing the broken, discarded mate to gain my sympathy? I let out a short, harsh laugh that sounded like tearing paper. Sympathy? I rasped, glaring at him. Do I look like I want your sympathy? If Ryan sent me, I would have come with 300 armed soldiers and a silver-tipped blade, not with frostbite and a ruined dress. He didn't send me. He doesn't even know this place exists. I pushed against his chest with both hands. It was like pushing against a mountain, but the defiance in the gesture was real. I am a ghost, I told him, my voice steadying, drawing strength from the cold stone at my back. And ghosts don't bleed for alphas anymore. If you want the ring, take it. Cut my finger off. But it won't wake up for you. It only wakes for the blood it recognizes. As if responding to my words, the sanctuary reacted. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the floor. The shattered stone tablet on the central dais pulsed with a faint, ghostly silver light, and the temperature in the room momentarily warmed. The ancient magic of the hall was reacting to my adrenaline, recognizing the faint, dormant bloodline struggling beneath my skin. Adrian felt it. His golden eyes darted to the glowing tablet, then back to my face. The suspicion in his gaze deepened into a profound, calculating wariness. He didn't know what I was. But he knew I wasn't just a discarded pack healer. Slowly, deliberately, he opened his hand and let me go. I slumped against the pillar, sliding down until my knees hit the stone floor. I gasped for air, my hands flying to my bruised throat, coughing violently as oxygen rushed back into my burning lungs. Adrian took a step back, smoothing the heavy fur of his cloak. His expression was completely unreadable. He didn't look at me with the sickening pity Sarah had shown, nor the arrogant dismissal of Ryan. He looked at me with a cold, detached assessment of a general evaluating a highly volatile, unexploded bomb that had just landed in his war room. The ring is a myth, he said, his voice flat, staring down at me. A children's story told to pups to make them believe the borderlands were once a kingdom of light, rather than a graveyard. My mother didn't tell stories, I said, my voice raspy and raw. She gave me a burden. And it seems I've carried it right into your hands. Adrian looked toward the massive, sealed stone doors. Outside, the muffled howling of the blizzard and the distant, maddened shrieks of the ferals could still be heard. The borderlands were waiting to consume whoever stepped back out into the dark. You're coming with me, he commanded, turning away from me. I pushed myself up from the floor, my legs trembling so violently I had to lean heavily against the pillar. I don't take orders from alphas. Adrian stopped. He slowly turned his head, looking over his broad shoulder. The shadows in the hall seemed to lengthen, drawn toward him by an invisible gravity. I'm not the kind of alpha you kneel to in a clean hall, Claire, he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. And I don't rule by Bloodclaw's laws. I'm the one who keeps the monsters on their side of the line. He pointed a heavily armored finger at my chest. You opened a door that shouldn't exist. You carry a ring that belongs in a grave. And until I decide whether you are a miracle or a plague sent to destroy what little order I have left. His golden eyes narrowed. You stay under my watch. He turned and began to walk toward a narrow, dark side passage I hadn't noticed before, hidden behind the high dais. He didn't look back to see if I was following. He didn't need to. He knew I had no choice. Outside was frozen death and a pack of rabid ferals. Inside was a man who ruled by fear and steel. I looked down at the ugly, heavy signet ring on my finger. It was cold again, the silver glow completely extinguished, leaving it looking like a piece of tarnished, worthless junk. I picked up my hunting dagger from the floor and slid it back into its sheath. I had escaped Ryan's gilded cage, where I was expected to be a silent, obedient shadow. But as I limped after the Rogue King into the dark, echoing tunnels beneath the mountain, I realized I had just stepped into a territory where the rules of the civilized world no longer applied. I had traded a prison of silk for a prison of stone. And in the borderlands, the only thing more dangerous than the monsters outside, was the man leading me deeper into the dark. The Rogue King's outpost, known to the outcasts as Frosthold, was not the fortress of polished stone and glass I had come to expect from Alpha Estates. It was a jagged, brutal scar of blackened iron and rough-hewn timber built directly into the side of a dead, frozen mountain. As I followed Adrian out of the tunnel and into the main encampment, the biting wind slammed into me, carrying a mixture of snow and ash. Torchlight flickered behind reinforced iron grates, casting long, dancing, demonic shadows across the snow-dusted courtyard. The architecture here wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to withstand a siege. And so were its people. Dozens of wolves had gathered in the courtyard to watch our arrival. These were not the uniform, disciplined warriors of Bloodclaw who polished their armor and paraded on feast days. These were the discarded. The exiled. They were a riot of brutal scars, mismatched scavenged furs, and hungry, hollow eyes. The air here was thick, suffocatingly so, with the scent of unwashed bodies, stale, cheap ale, and a simmering, violent desperation that made the hair on my arms stand up. Every instinct I had as a healer screamed at me to step back. I could smell the rot of untreated wounds, the metallic tang of borderline malnutrition, and the underlying, sour scent of wolves slowly losing their minds to the ambient corruption of the borderlands. As Adrian walked through the crowd, the wolves parted for him, dropping their gazes in a hard-wired display of submission. But as I limped after him, my ruined leathers clinging to my freezing frame, the murmur started. "Look at that," a scarred beta sneered, his eyes tracking the stumbling rhythm of my walk. "A high-bred omega, fresh from the southern valleys. Still smells like lavender and weak excuses." "Adrian," a woman called out, stepping directly into our path, forcing us to stop. She was tall, her lean muscles corded and tense like whipcord under a patched leather vest. A jagged, angry white scar ran from her temple, narrowly missing her left eye, down to her jawline. "Mara," Adrian acknowledged, his voice devoid of any inflection. He didn't stop moving forward, forcing her to step aside or be trampled. Mara stepped sideways but kept pace with him. "The scouts say North Reach is expanding their patrols. They're looking to secure the lower pass before the heavy snows hit. And the border pits, they're paying triple this month." Adrian didn't look at her. "She's not for sale, Mara." "Everything is for sale in the borderlands, Blackwood," Mara countered, her voice rising, intentionally projecting her words to reach the ears of the growing crowd. "We are critically low on moonstone shards. Half the vanguard is already shaking at the edge of degradation, and winter hasn't even begun. The southern pack's North Reach, Bloodclaw, they would trade a year's supply of refined shards for a high-born, pack-linked hostage." A low, rumbling growl of agreement rippled through the gathered wolves. Several men stepped forward, closing the circle around us. Their postures were aggressive, their eyes flashing with predatory, desperate greed that made my skin crawl. "Think about it," Mara pressed, gesturing toward me with a sneer. "An Omega from the Alpha S inner circle? A trained pack healer? She's a walking vault of leverage. Hand her over to the quartermasters. We'll lock her in the holding pens until we can arrange a blind drop at the neutral zone." I stopped walking. I was exhausted. My lungs were still burning from the thin air of the sanctuary, my hands were numb from the frost, and the phantom pain of my severed mate bond was a rhythmic, agonizing ache behind my ribs. But as I looked at the circle of wolves closing in, wolves who looked at me not as a person, but as a sack of grain to be bartered for survival, a cold, hard clarity took over. I wasn't a piece of meat. I wasn't currency. And I was done being a pawn in other people's wars. "I am not your prize." My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the murmurs of the courtyard like a silver blade. The crowd went dead silent. Mara blinked, her lip curling into a mocking, ugly sneer. "Listen to it chirp. The little pet thinks it still has pack rights. It thinks it has a choice." She reached out, her large, calloused hand moving toward the collar of my leather jacket, a gesture of casual, humiliating dominance meant to physically drag me toward the holding pens. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. In a fraction of a second, I reached into the side pocket of my satchel, my fingers closing around a small, dried bundle of ghost leaf and cinder root, the same highly toxic mixture I had used to mask my scent. I hadn't washed the concentrated paste off my wrists. As her hand closed on my shoulder, I twisted my body sharply, bringing my arm up and slamming my coated wrist directly against the sensitive, exposed skin of her palm. "Don't touch me," I whispered. Mara let out a sharp, guttural cry, snatching her hand back as if she de-grabbed a hot iron. The contact with the concentrated toxin on my skin sent an immediate, localized, stinging paralysis through the nerve endings in her hand. It wouldn't kill her. But her fingers instantly curled into a rigid, agonizing claw. The courtyard erupted in a chorus of furious snarls. 5 warriors shifted partially, the sound of bones cracking and reforming echoing off the iron walls. Their claws extended, tearing through their gloves, and their muzzles lengthened into terrifying, toothy masks. "Kill the southern bitch," someone roared from the back. Suddenly, the air in the courtyard vanished entirely. The crushing weight of Adrian's presence hit the clearing like an avalanche. It wasn't the loud, booming, performative authority of Ryan. It was a silent, lethal vacuum that suffocated the aggression out of the air. The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees in a single heartbeat. Adrian turned. He didn't shift. He didn't bare his teeth. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply stood there, his golden eyes sweeping over the crowd with a terrifying, detached indifference. "I said," Adrian began, his low rumble making the loose stones on the ground vibrate, "she is not for sale." Mara was clutching her paralyzed hand to her chest, her face pale with a mixture of fury and sudden terror, but she didn't dare move. The 5 warriors who had been ready to lunge were now frozen mid-shift, their eyes fixed firmly on the frozen dirt, their tails tucked between their legs in a primal, involuntary display of absolute submission. "The Borderlands has no laws," Adrian continued, stepping slowly toward Mara. He didn't touch her, but she flinched violently as if he struck her with a whip. "But Frosthold has one. My word is the boundary. You cross it, you die." He looked away from her, his gaze sweeping the terrified crowd before landing heavily on me. "She is my prisoner," he declared, his voice ringing like a tolling bell through the iron-bound courtyard. "She stays in the North Tower. Anyone who touches her, anyone who speaks of selling her, anyone who so much as looks at her with teeth bared, will answer to me. Do I make myself clear?" A ragged, fearful chorus of yes, Blackwood echoed through the dark. It was thick with resentment, but the obedience was absolute. Adrian turned back to me. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He looked at me as if I were a weapon left on his table by an enemy too valuable to throw away, too dangerous to touch carelessly. "Follow," he commanded. I followed him through the maze of timber and iron, walking past the cowering rogues, up a winding set of steep stone stairs that smelled of damp earth and old blood. He led me to a small, circular room at the top of a watchtower. It was brutally sparse: a narrow cot, a small wooden table, and a single, unglassed window with heavy iron bars that looked out over the jagged, snowy peaks of the north. "You're smarter than you look, Claire," he said, pausing at the heavy oak doorway. "But don't think that parlor trick with the herbs will save you a second time. My people are starving, and a starving wolf doesn't care about a stinging palm. They care about survival." "Why did you stop them?" I asked, leaning heavily against the cold stone wall, finally letting my exhaustion show. "If everything in the Borderlands is for sale, and if your people are desperate enough to trade a hostage for moonstones, why keep a broken Omega?" Adrian looked at my right hand. The signet ring was dark and silent, but I knew he hadn't forgotten the silver light in the sanctuary. "Because the Borderlands are dying," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of the alpha command he had used in the courtyard. "And you're the first thing I've seen in a decade that the Earth actually recognized." He stepped out into the hall. "Sleep, little ghost," he said, his golden eyes locking onto mine one last time. "Tomorrow, we find out if you're a miracle or a curse." The heavy iron-reinforced door slammed shut. The lock clicked with a heavy, metallic finality that echoed in the small room. I was alone. I sank onto the thin, scratchy blanket of the cot, listening to the wind howl against the tower stones. I looked at my hands. They were dirty, bruised, and stained with the dark green toxins of the wild. Ryan had wanted to keep me as a docile pet in the servants' quarters. Sarah had wanted to keep me as a living monument to her victory. Mara had wanted to sell me to the highest bidder to buy another month of sanity for her soldiers. But Adrian? Adrian had not protected me out of kindness. He had protected me because I was a risk he wasn't ready to discard. I closed my eyes, the freezing air of the Borderlands filling my lungs. I was in a cage of ice and iron, surrounded by starving monsters, and led by a king who was the most dangerous predator of them all. For the first time in my life, no one was pretending the cage was mercy. Here, at least, the bars were honest. The peace of my honest cage lasted exactly 4 hours. I spent those hours in a silent, grueling battle against the toxic remains of the cinder root. Every pass of the rough cloth against my blistered wrists was a fresh agony, the near-freezing water from the corner bucket doing little to dull the fire. The liquid was so cold it made my bones ache, yet it felt like steam against the stinging heat of the poison. As a healer, the diagnosis was clear: permanent nerve damage was the inevitable cost if the toxin seeped any deeper into the muscle. My hands, the only tools I had ever truly owned, were at risk of becoming useless weights. But a dead Omega had no use for her hands. I scrubbed until the skin was raw and weeping, my breath hitching in the freezing air. I wrapped my wrists in clean strips torn from the hem of my ruined underskirt, pulling the knots tight with my teeth. The physical pain served as a grounding force, a sharp anchor in the storm of my thoughts. It kept the phantom ache of the severed mate bond at bay, pushing the memory of Ryan's betrayal and Sarah's triumphant smile into a dark corner of my mind. Here, in the brutal cold of Frosthold, self-pity was a luxury I couldn't afford. Survival required a different kind of arithmetic, one where every breath was a hard-won victory. I had just tied the second knot when a sudden, bone-chilling howl ripped through the mountain air. The sound lacked the proud, melodic ring of a pack guard. It was a jagged, broken cry, filled with a hunger so profound it felt like a physical void. It was the scream of a creature that had forgotten the meaning of being full, a sound that scraped against the very instinct of life. Ferals. The howling was immediately answered by the frantic clanging of an iron bell from the courtyard. The deep strikes vibrated through the stone floor, shaking dust from the rafters. The fortress was waking up for war. I scrambled to the narrow window, the wind whipping my hair across my face. Below, the courtyard of Frosthold had dissolved into chaos. The heavy timber gates, reinforced with blackened iron, were sagging inward. The bolts groaned under the weight of something massive slamming against them, a rhythmic thud like a giantess heartbeat. Beyond the walls, a sea of glowing, sickly yellow eyes stared back through the driving snow. "Hold the line." Mara's voice rose above the din. She stood near the center of the courtyard, her paralyzed hand tucked into her belt. With her good hand, she wielded a heavy, silver-tipped spear. The rogue warriors around her were shifting, the sound of bones cracking and reforming echoing off the iron walls. These wolves were gaunt, their ribs showing through matted fur. Their shifts were slow and clearly painful, starving warriors facing monsters that knew no fear. The gates exploded. Timber shattered inward, sending splinters like javelins into the courtyard. 2 rogues were impaled instantly as a wave of gray and black fur flooded through the breach. These creatures had long since shed their wolfhood. They were husks of muscle and rage, their fur matted with black bile. Their limbs were elongated at unnatural angles, moving with terrifying speed. Their muzzles dripped with corrosive saliva that hissed and steamed as it hit the snow, eating away at the ground. They had lost their connection to the moon goddess, leaving only a rabid shell driven by an endless hunger for flesh and moonstone resonance. The vanguard clashed in a slaughterhouse. The ferals fought without tactics or self-preservation. They threw themselves onto silver-tipped spears, letting metal burn through their organs just to get their jaws around a rogue's throat. It was mindless, suicidal aggression. The air grew thick with the smell of copper, wet fur, and acrid bile. Then Adrian appeared. He dropped from the high balcony, his heavy black cloak billowing behind him. He remained in human form, moving with a speed that defied the natural laws of the pack. Wielding 2 jagged blades of blackened steel, he landed in the center of a cluster of ferals, the impact cracking the stone beneath his boots. Every strike was lethal. Every movement was a lesson in brutal economy. He moved in silence, lacking the performative snarls Ryan used to favor. Adrian was a reaper, stepping through the chaos as if he were part of the storm. He severed tendons, crushed windpipes, and decapitated the monsters without a wasted breath. But there were too many of them. The breach was too wide. For every feral he felled, 3 more scrambled over the walls, drawn by the scent of fresh meat and the terrified pulses of the defenders. I gripped the iron bars, my knuckles turning white. I was trapped. If the courtyard fell, I would be nothing more than a cornered snack. The tower door suddenly groaned. I spun around, my breath hitching. A violent scratching on the other side signaled that a feral had bypassed the main courtyard, scaling the exterior wall. I backed away, heart hammering. My hunting dagger was on the small wooden table. I dove for it just as the door gave way. The hinges screamed as the door was ripped inward. A massive, mangled paw forced its way through, blackened claws digging into the oak. The monster hauled its deformed body inside a nightmare in fur and bone with half a face missing and a jaw hanging by a single tendon. Its right eye glowed with sickly yellow light. It didn't growl. Feral saved their breath for the bite. It lunged. The monster crashed into the table before I could reach the dagger, shattering the wood into kindling. The impact threw me backward, my spine slamming against the stone wall. The dagger slipped from my numb fingers, sliding out of reach. The feral scrambled over the wreckage, its spine snapping with an unnatural rhythm. It smelled of rot and decaying iron. It lunged again, heavy paws pinning my legs to the floor, saliva-dripping jaws aiming for my throat. "Get off!" I screamed, shoving my bandaged palms against the monster's matted chest. Corrosive saliva dripped onto my collarbone, burning through my shirt like acid. The contact was electric. As my palms pressed against the violent, thundering heartbeat of the monster, something deep inside me, something buried under years of submissive training, snapped awake. The strength that surged through me felt nothing like adrenaline. It was a cold, oceanic pressure. My blood began to hum. The sensation started in my marrow, a resonant vibration rushing through my veins. The mark of the severed mate bond on my neck suddenly felt like a drop of absolute zero ice. The air in the room became a vacuum. A heavy, ancient silence slammed down, crushing the noise of the battle outside. A scent exploded from my pulse points. My natural lavender scent vanished, replaced by the smell of deep earth and frozen stone, a power that had ruled these mountains centuries before the first alpha. The feral froze. Its jaw was mere inches from my face. It stopped moving. Its single yellow eye widened, the pupil shrinking. For 3 agonizing seconds, the madness receded. The sickly yellow flickered, replaced by a momentary flash of clear amber, the eye of a normal wolf. The monster let out a sound that wasn't a snarl, but a high, thin, terribly human whimper of agony. It was the sound of a trapped soul realizing what its body had become. The feral hesitated. Its claws retracted from my legs. It took a jerky step backward, shaking its massive head as if trying to dislodge a parasite. But the cost was tearing me apart. Pressure in my head spiked. A hot rush of copper flooded my mouth, and blood poured from my nose, dripping down my chin to mix with the monster's saliva. My vision blurred into static. My temperature plummeted until I began to convulse, my teeth chattering violently. I couldn't hold it. The scent and the hum in my blood collapsed, draining out of me and leaving an empty, freezing void. The feral shook its head, clear amber vanishing instantly, swallowed by rabid yellow. The madness rushed back. But before it could lunge, a shadow filled the doorway. Adrian. He moved faster than my blurring eyes could track. His blackened steel blade drove through the feral's neck, severing the spinal cord. The monster collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, dead before it registered the strike. Adrian pulled his blade free, black bile sizzling on the floor. His face was splattered with blood, his chest heaving slightly, the only sign he had fought through a courtyard of horrors to reach the tower. He looked at the dead monster, then slowly turned his gaze down to me. I was huddled against the wall, shivering uncontrollably, blood pouring from my nose. I looked like the weakest thing in the borderlands. But Adrian's golden eyes were wide, the pupils blown dark. He was staring at me, his nostrils flaring as he caught the lingering remnants of the scent. He had seen the feral hesitate. He had seen a rabid monster momentarily regain its sanity. He didn't step forward to help me up. He offered no word of comfort. The silence between us stretched, heavier than the corpses below. The way he looked at me had changed. I was no longer a victim or a spy. I was a liability he couldn't afford to discard, a variable that threatened the foundation of his border. He looked at me like a question that could kill his entire pack if he answered it wrong. "You're not supposed to be able to do that," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The silence in the tower room followed the feral's death like a heavy shroud, thick and suffocating. I lay against the rough masonry, my body hollowed out by the violent drain of the power that had just awakened. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, it felt as if a tide had gone out, leaving my soul a barren, salt-cracked landscape. The air still hummed with a phantom authority, a resonant, ancient frequency that made the stone walls feel as if they were leaning in to listen, acknowledging a master they hadn't heard in centuries. Every breath was a shallow gasp against the crushing weight of the atmosphere, the copper taste of blood thick and metallic in my throat. Adrian stood over the carcass, his blackened steel blades dripping with bile. The dark, oily fluid sizzled against the stone, releasing a stench of rot and decaying iron. Blood splattered across his hard face like war paint, emphasizing the predatory sharpness of his cheekbones and the cold, disciplined fury in his eyes. He ignored the kill, his focus fixed entirely on me. His golden eyes narrowed, searching for something beneath my skin, evaluating me with the terrifying intensity of a man deciding whether to salvage a weapon or destroy it before it could explode in his hands. "Don't move," he commanded. The alpha command was gone, replaced by a quieter, sharper caution, the stillness of a man standing over a live explosive. He didn't need the roar of his power to keep me pinned. The sheer weight of his presence, combined with the absolute void where my strength used to be, held me against the stone. He stepped over the dead feral, his boots crunching on the splinters of the shattered table. The sound was deafening in the unnatural quiet of the room. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice a low hum that vibrated in the small room, resonating with the ache in my bones. I don't know," I rasped, my voice like glass dragging over stone. "It just happened. It was going to kill me. I didn't have a choice." Adrian looked down at the feral. He nudged the monster's shoulder with a heavy boot, studying the way the claws had retracted in those final seconds. He was looking for a weakness, or perhaps a miracle, but his expression remained an unreadable mask of stone. He was a man who had seen everything the borderlands could throw at a soul, yet for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that might have been genuine uncertainty in the depths of his molten gaze. "Adrian!" Mara's voice barked from the hallway, sharp with adrenaline and the raw edge of panic. She burst in, silver-tipped spear held high, her eyes wild. She stopped dead at the scene, the rogue king standing over the bleeding Omega and the dead monster. The smell of the courtyard followed her in, smoke, wet fur, and the acrid tang of silver-burned flesh. "The breach is sealed," she panted, her suspicion a jagged edge in the room as she looked at me. But something happened. The one in the west breach, it stopped. For 3 seconds. It just stood there, shaking its head like it had forgotten how to bite. It looked confused. Long enough for Bren to cut its throat. Her grip tightened around the spear. It was like it saw a ghost. "Adrian. The men are talking. They're scared. They think the land is turning against us." Adrian didn't look at her. His eyes remained on me, tracking the way my pulse fluttered at the base of my throat. "And the others? The rest of the pack?" "Dead," Mara said, her lip curling as she looked at me. Her hatred was a visible force, a silent promise of violence for the outsider who had brought this strange, terrifying change to their war. "But the infirmary is overflowing. We're out of stabilized moonstone solution. The wounded are turning, Adrian. We've had to put down 3 of our own in the last hour because the infection reached the marrow. If another wave hits before dawn, we won't hold the gates." Her voice dropped. "We're bleeding out, and the dark is getting hungrier." "Get the cleanup crews," Adrian interrupted, his voice cold and final, cutting through her panic like a blade. "Burn the carcasses. Every single one. I want nothing left but ash." His gaze remained fixed on me. "And tell the sentries, if a single whisper of that hesitation leaves this fortress, I will feed them to the pits myself." Do I make myself clear? No one speaks of ghosts in Frosthold. We deal in steel and survival, nothing else. Mara flinched at the raw power in his voice. She looked at me one last time, a look that promised a slow, painful death if she ever got me alone, and retreated into the hall, her boots echoing like hammer blows against the stone. The room returned to a silence that felt even heavier than before. Adrian walked toward me, his massive presence sucking the air from the room. He didn't reach for my throat this time. Instead, he took my right hand in a grip like a vice, turning it over to inspect the palm. He ignored my raw skin and the makeshift bandages I had tied earlier, his focus entirely on the signet ring. The metal was cold, looking like a piece of worthless junk on the finger of a discarded girl. But as Adrian pressed his thumb against the smooth face of the ring, I felt a faint, answering throb, a rhythmic, ancient heartbeat that seemed to mock my exhaustion. The earth itself seemed to be breathing through the metal, a deep resonance that vibrated in my very bones, connecting me to the mountain beneath us. The old stories say the borderlands used to answer to blood, he said, his voice a dangerous, inquisitive whisper. I never believed them. I thought the land was just a graveyard for those the packs didn't want. Fairy tales told to pups to make the dark less scary. His thumb pressed harder against the ring. But the land remembers, even if we forget. It reacted to you, Claire. It recognized something in you that it should not have remembered at all. My mother told me the ring was a burden, I whispered, my heart hammering against his palm. She said it was a memory of a time before the walls. In the borderlands, those are the same thing, Adrian countered. He leaned in until his nose brushed my temple, his scent of winter storms and cedarwood overwhelming my senses. He wasn't searching for a miracle. He was measuring a threat. You're a disaster waiting to happen, Claire of Bloodclaw, he murmured. You woke something under Frosthold. I don't know how far it hurt you, and that is exactly the problem. His voice dropped lower. If the ferals can be stopped by a scent, then the alphas in the south will burn this mountain to the ground to own it. He stepped back, his expression settling into a cold, disciplined stillness. The inquisitive whisper was gone, replaced by the iron will of the rogue king. I'm going to use you. I looked at the dead feral, then back at him. As a healer, I had spent my life preserving life, even in the weakest, most broken wolves. But here, life was secondary to survival. I had felt the wolf inside that nightmare reaching out for an end to the madness, a brief flash of clear amber that spoke of a soul still trapped in the rot. And Adrian had killed it without a second thought, without even acknowledging that there had been anything left to save. Use me wrong, I said, my voice steadying despite the bone-deep exhaustion, and you'll find out I cut both ways. I'm not a pawn on your board, Adrian. I forced my shaking hand into a fist. I'm not a moonstone you can just mine until I'm empty. Adrian's golden eyes flared with molten intensity. A faint, dark smile touched his lips, a grim recognition of my defiance. He understood threats. They were more honest than submission, and in this moment, they were the only thing that made me real to him. You're a healer, he said, ignoring my threat as if it were the buzzing of an insect. Starting tonight, you work in the infirmary. Under guard. You will keep my vanguard breathing until dawn. You will use whatever knowledge you have to stabilize the wounded. His gaze dropped briefly to the blood drying on my chin. Tomorrow, we find out what else your blood can do, and how much of this mountain is actually listening to you. You killed it, I said, gesturing to the carcass, my anger finally overriding the cold. It stopped. It was human again for 1 second. It whimpered, Adrian. It was asking for help, and you just cut its throat like slaughter stock. It was a monster, Claire, Adrian said, his voice flat and devoid of regret. In this place, we don't have the luxury of remembering who they used to be. We only have the luxury of surviving what they are now. If I had waited even a second longer, it would have ripped your throat out. Memory doesn't stop hunger, and it doesn't stop the rot. His eyes hardened. You want to save souls? Save the ones who are still fighting for this fortress. He walked toward the doorway, his black cloak snapping around his heels. He stopped only to look over his broad shoulder, the shadows of the hall closing around him like armor. Clean yourself up. A guard will be at your door in an hour to take you to the lower levels. Don't think about running. The blizzard is back, and the feral sure scent didn't reach are still out there, waiting for meat that doesn't make them hesitate. His golden eyes locked onto mine. The border has marked you now, little ghost. Make sure you're worth the trouble. He walked out, leaving the door hanging on its broken hinges. The open door was a challenge, a reminder that I was trapped as much by the land itself as by his walls. He didn't need to lock me in. The borderlands would do that for him. I looked at my hands, stained with a mixture of my own blood and the black, oily bile of the monster. The bandages were soaked through, turning a muddy, sickly gray. My wrists throbbed with a rhythmic, burning heat, a reminder of the price I had paid to get here. Ryan had wanted a docile pet to decorate his hall. Sarah had wanted a trophy to prove her victory. Mara had wanted to sell me to the highest bidder to buy another month of sanity for her soldiers. Adrian wanted something colder. He measured me in moonstones and dead monsters, in how many wounded men I could keep breathing before dawn, in how long my blood could hold back the dark. The open door changed nothing. My prison had simply moved from the tower to the infirmary. I was no longer a prisoner of his suspicion. I was an experiment in his survival. A dangerous asset he would use until I broke, or until I became too dangerous to keep. A weapon he had found in the snow. And he was going to wield me until the edge dulled or the handle snapped. I pushed myself up from the floor, my legs shaking so violently I had to lean against the wall for support. At the window, the fires were being lit in the courtyard below, black smoke carrying the stench of rot and burnt hair into the winter sky. The honest cage had expanded. The bars were no longer just iron and stone. They were the blood on my hands and the scent that shouldn't exist. I was no longer an Omega from Bloodclaw. I was a ghost that had finally started to cast a shadow, a variable in a war I didn't understand. I had escaped a pack that didn't want me, only to fall into the hands of a king who would spend every drop of my blood to hold a crumbling line against the dark. I had traded a slow death in the south for a violent one in the north. And as the freezing wind howled through the bars, carrying the distant, maddened shrieks of the things waiting in the dark, I realized that in the borderlands, the only thing more dangerous than being forgotten was being seen. I was seen now. And the border was not going to let me go. The hour Adrian had given me felt less like a reprieve and more like a countdown to a different kind of execution. I used the freezing water from the stone basin to scrub the feral espile from my skin. It was stubborn, oily stuff that clung to the pores, smelling of old graves and stagnant iron. My hands shook as I worked, the raw skin of my palms stinging under the friction. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the amber light in the monster-esque gaze, that brief, flickering moment of humanity that Adrian had extinguished without a blink. I wasn't just cleaning off blood. I was trying to wash away the realization that I had just become part of this machine. In Bloodclaw, I had been a ghost, a shadow that moved through the halls unnoticed until I was needed to heal a scrape or brew a tea. Here, I was a focal point. A variable. A weapon that didn't know its own trigger. I dressed in the heavy, fur-lined leathers Adrian had provided. They were too big, the scent of cedar and old snow clinging to the hide, but they were warmer than anything I had ever owned in the south. As I pulled the laces tight, I felt the weight of the signet ring against my chest, tucked beneath my tunic. It was silent now. But the memory of its heartbeat was a phantom pulse against my skin. A sharp rap on the broken door made me jump. Mara stood in the hallway, her silver-tipped spear held loosely but ready. She looked at me with cold, clinical loathing. To her, I wasn't a guest or even a prisoner. I was a breach in her walls that hadn't been plugged yet. "Move," she said. "The king doesn't like to wait, and the infirmary is already screaming." She didn't wait for a response. I followed her down the winding stone stairs of the tower, my boots echoing against the damp masonry. The fortress of Frosthold was a labyrinth of grey stone and jagged iron, built into the very bones of the mountain. It felt less like a building and more like a rib cage, protecting the heart of the border from the madness outside. We passed through a wide hall where warriors were sharpening blades and mending armor. They were different from the wolves of the south. There was no gold here. No decorative silk. No posturing for status. They were lean, scarred, and quiet. When they looked at me, their eyes didn't hold the pity I was used to. They held a sharp, predatory curiosity. They had heard the rumors. They knew the ferals had stopped. Mara led me to a heavy iron door at the end of the hall. She pushed it open, revealing a room that smelled of old parchment and cold ash. Adrian was standing by a massive stone hearth, staring into the dying embers. He had changed his clothes, but the scent of the kill still hung around him like a cloak. He looked larger in the firelight, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark wing. "Leave us," he commanded without turning. Mara hesitated, her grip tightening on her spear. "Adrian, the men are talking. They want to know why an Omega from the south is still breathing in the inner circle." "Then tell them to focus on their whetstones," Adrian said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "If they have enough breath to gossip, they have enough breath for extra shifts on the ramparts. Go." Mara stiffened, gave me one last murderous look, and retreated. The door clanged shut, the sound vibrating in my teeth. Adrian finally turned. He didn't move toward me, but the space between us felt charged, as if the air itself were tightening. "You survived the first night," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation of a fact he found inconvenient. Most Omegas would have been a pile of bones in the courtyard by now. "You didn't scream. You didn't beg. You just bled." "I've had practice," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. In Bloodclaw, begging never changed the outcome. It only made the alphas feel more powerful. Adrian's eyes flared with a brief, golden light. "Power is a currency here, Claire. We don't spend it on vanity. We spend it on survival." He took one slow step closer. You showed a power tonight that shouldn't exist in a discarded girl from the south. That scent, it didn't just stop the feral. It reached the land. It reached the mountain. He walked toward me, his footsteps silent on the stone. He stopped just inches away, his presence a wall of heat and iron. His large hand hovered near my throat before settling on my shoulder. His grip was firm, a reminder of the strength that could crush me in a second. I've sent scouts to the breach, he said. The land is quiet there now. Too quiet. Whatever you did, you left a mark. And marks attract hunters. I didn't ask for this, I whispered. The borderlands don't care what you asked for, Adrian countered. They only care what you can give. His grip tightened slightly. You are a healer. You will work in the lower levels. You will stabilize my men. If that scent rises again, you do not let anyone see it unless I am there. Do you understand? You're asking me to be your secret weapon, I said, a spark of anger cutting through my exhaustion. You're no different from Ryan. He wanted me to be his silent shadow. You want me to be your hidden blade. Adrian leaned down, his face inches from mine. Ryan wanted a trophy. I want a future for my people. If that makes me a monster in your eyes, then so be it. His voice dropped lower. But in this fortress, you are under my protection and my watch. If you run, the ferals will find you. If you betray me, I will find you. A pause. There is no third option. He let go of my shoulder. The absence of his touch left a strange chill. He walked to a heavy oak desk and picked up a small, leather-bound book. He tossed it to me. I caught it, the weight of it surprising me. It's a ledger of the infirmary's supplies, he said. Or what's left of them. Mara will take you there. You will report to her, but you answer only to me. His mouth curved, barely. If she tries to kill you, try not to die before I can stop her. That's very reassuring, I muttered. Adrian's lip curled in a ghost of a smile. Honesty is the only luxury we have left, Claire. Now go. The dark is long, and the wounded are waiting. As I walked toward the door, his voice stopped me one last time. And Claire? I turned. The ring. Keep it hidden. If the alphas in the south realize what you took from their vaults, they won't just send scouts. They send an army. I didn't take it from their vaults, I said, my hand instinctively going to my chest. It was never theirs. Adrian watched me for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. In their minds, everything is theirs. Remember that. I walked out into the hall, where Mara was waiting. She didn't say a word as she led me toward the stairs that descended into the bowels of the fortress. As I descended, leaving the cold moonlight of the tower behind, I felt the weight of the honest cage settling around me. I was no longer a ghost. I was a prisoner of necessity, a variable in a war that had been raging since before I was born. A healer in a place that only knew how to kill. And something the land remembered before I did. Hundreds of miles to the south, the sun was setting over the golden spires of Bloodclaw. Ryan sat in his private study, the air thick with the scent of expensive incense and the underlying, jagged tang of his own agitation. He stared at the map on his desk, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm against the parchment. The Luna ceremony should have brought peace. It should have solidified his rule and calmed the wolf beneath his skin. Instead, he felt as if he were vibrating at a frequency slightly off, a constant, low-level hum of irritation that made every sound too loud and every scent too sharp. A soft knock at the door preceded Sarah's entrance. She was dressed in shimmering silver silk, her hair a perfect cascade of gold. She smelled of jasmine and honey, a scent that should have been intoxicating. Ryan, she said, her voice a melodic purr. The elders are asking about the moonstone shipment from the North Reach. It's 2 days late. Ryan didn't look up. It's a logistics issue, Sarah. The storms have been heavy. The storms are always heavy, Sarah said, walking behind him and placing her hands on his shoulders. Her touch was light, practiced. But the miners are whispering. They say the veins are turning gray. They say the land is mourning. Ryan stiffened. The land doesn't mourn. It produces. Tell the miners to double their shifts or I'll find men who will. Sarah sighed, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. You're tense, my love. The rejection was hard on your wolf, I know. But it was necessary. Claire was a weight we couldn't carry. I know, Ryan snapped, finally looking up. His eyes were a dark, turbulent gold. I don't need to be reminded of why I did it. She was an Omega. She was weak. She would have been a liability in the coming wars. Then why do you keep looking at her empty rooms? Sarah asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Ryan stood up abruptly, shaking off her hands. I don't. I was checking the inventory. She left behind things that belonged to the pack. She left behind everything, Sarah pointed out. Except that old ring. The one her mother used to hide. Ryan turned to the window, looking out over the sprawling city. It was a piece of junk. A sentimental trinket. It has no value. Before Sarah could respond, a messenger burst into the room, his face pale and covered in the dust of a long ride. He fell to one knee, holding out a sealed scroll. Alpha, the man panted. A report from the border scouts. Ryan snatched the scroll, his heart hammering with a sudden, inexplicable dread. He broke the seal and scanned the lines. Anomalous report from the northern border, near the Frosthold Wastes. A reconnaissance unit encountered a localized surge in atmospheric pressure. A feral pack was observed pausing mid-charge, losing aggression for approximately 3 seconds. No identifiable cause was found. Survivors mention an unusual coldness in the air. Ryan's grip tightened on the parchment. It wasn't the scent he was recognizing the report, didn't he mention it, but the feeling. The sheer impossibility of it. Ferals didn't stop. They didn't hesitate. They were engines of rot and hunger. To have one stop. It was like the earth had momentarily forgotten how to spin. What is it? Sarah asked, her eyes narrowing. Ryan didn't answer. He stared at the words until they blurred. He had told himself she would be dead within 3 days. He had told himself she would crawl back, begging for the scraps of his mercy. He had told himself she was nothing. But the phantom of her existence was a persistent, nagging itch in his mind. The void left by the broken bond wasn't closing. It was widening, a jagged crack in his foundation that made everything else feel fragile. Ryan? Sarah's voice was sharper now, a hint of steel beneath the silk. Just a rumor of ghosts in the north, Ryan said, his voice low and dangerous. He crumpled the report and tossed it into the fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken in the heat. The border is becoming unstable. It's to be expected with the storms. As Sarah left, her expression a mask of hidden suspicion, Ryan watched the flames. He didn't want to think about Claire. He didn't want to admit that the nothing he had thrown away was the only thing his wolf was still howling for. Corin, he barked. His personal guard stepped into the room from the shadow of the door. Alpha. Send someone north, Ryan commanded, his eyes glowing with a dark, predatory light. Quietly. Use the back channels. I want to know whether the girl survived. And I want to know what exactly happened at the northern breach. You think she went to the border, Alpha? An Omega alone? I think she knows something she had no right to keep from me, Ryan said, his voice a flat, iron line. Find out what? Quietly. As the guard left, Ryan turned back to the window. He had rejected her. He had given her away. But as the freezing wind of the north seemed to brush against his skin, miles away from the mountain, Ryan realized that the one thing he couldn't tolerate wasn't Clara's death. It was the idea that she had actually stayed gone. How dare she, he whispered to the empty room, his fingers digging into the edge of the stone sill. How dare she survive without me? The descent into the lower levels of Frosthold felt like sinking into the throat of a dying beast. As Mara led me deeper into the mountain, the air grew thick and heavy, saturated with the copper tang of blood and the acrid, chemical burn of low-grade moonstone solution. The clean, biting cold of the upper towers was replaced by a humid, stagnant heat that clung to my skin like a fever. Every step echoed against the damp stone walls, the sound swallowed by the low, rhythmic thrum of the mountain's heart, or perhaps it was the machinery of the fortress, grinding away in the dark. Mara stopped before a massive iron-bound door, the surface pitted with rust and scarred by claw marks. She didn't look at me as she shoved it open. Welcome to the pit, she said, her voice devoid of anything but a cold, jagged edge. Try not to get bitten. We don't have the supplies to waste on an Omega who can't watch her own back. The room beyond was a nightmare of efficiency and desperation. It was a long, vaulted chamber, lit by flickering torches that cast long, dancing shadows against the soot-stained ceiling. Rows of narrow stone slabs served as beds, most of them occupied by wolves in various stages of agony. This wasn't the clean, organized infirmary of Blood Claw, where healers moved in soft silks and the air was perfumed with lavender. This was a slaughterhouse trying to pass as a sanctuary. The sound hit me first, a cacophony of low growls, wet coughs, and the rhythmic clanking of silver chains. The scent followed, a suffocating mixture of rotting flesh, burnt hair, and the sharp, ozone-like smell of silver-burned skin. "Over there," Mara said, pointing to a corner where a pile of blood-soaked bandages and rusted instruments lay on a stained wooden table. "That's your station. You'll start with the overflow. The ones the real doctors won't touch because they're too far gone to be worth the moonstone." I walked toward the table, my boots sticking slightly to the floor. I didn't look at the men on the slabs yet. I needed to see what I had to work with. I opened the leather-bound ledger Adrian had given me, then looked at the meager supplies on the table. A few jars of gray, gritty salve. A bundle of frayed linen. A single, dull silver needle. "Where are the herbs?" I asked, turning back to Mara. "I need cinder root for the infections and ghost leaf for the pain. And the moonstone solution, this smells like it's been diluted with river water." Mara stepped closer, her eyes narrowing until they were mere slits of icy blue. "You get what we give you. We don't waste the good stuff on the dying, and we certainly don't give it to a girl who might be poisoning our water supply by morning." She reached out and snatched the small pouch of dried herbs I had managed to keep from my journey. "I'll be taking these for inspection. If you need anything, you ask me. And if I say no, you make do." "You're killing them," I said, my voice low and steady despite the roar of anger in my chest. "Diluted solution won't stop the mineral rot. It only masks the scent while the poison eats the marrow. If you don't let me use the proper ratios. If I wanted your opinion on our logistics, I would have asked for it while I was gutting you in the courtyard," Mara interrupted, her face inches from mine. "You are here to work, not to lecture. Now get to it. Or I'll find a slab for you, too." She turned on her heel and walked away, her spear clattering against the stone. I stood alone in the corner, the weight of the room pressing in on me. I looked down at my hands, then at the first slab. The man lying there was a mountain of a wolf, his chest broad and scarred, but his skin was a sickly, translucent gray. A jagged tear ran from his shoulder to his hip, the edges of the wound blackened and weeping a dark, oily fluid. I could see the faint, rhythmic pulse of his veins, but they weren't red. They were traced with thin, spiderweb lines of obsidian. Mineral rot. The land's revenge for the moonstones we tore from its heart. The herbs were gone, and the pure solution remained out of reach. All I had left was the knowledge my mother had drilled into me since I was old enough to hold a mortar and pestle, a survival kit built of memory and grit. I stripped off my heavy outer coat and rolled up my sleeves. I ignored the stares of the other healers, lean, exhausted men and women who looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and weary hope. I picked up the dull needle and a piece of linen. "I need boiling water," I said to a young pup who was hauling a bucket of slop. He froze, looking at me with wide, startled eyes. "Now. And a clean bowl. If you want this man to keep his arm, move." The boy scrambled away. I turned back to the wounded warrior. He was conscious, his eyes a clouded, turbulent amber. He growled as I reached for his shoulder, a low, vibrating sound that made the stone beneath my feet hum. "I'm not here to hurt you," I whispered, my voice falling into the rhythmic, soothing cadence of a healer. I didn't use the royal scent. Not yet. It was too dangerous. Too loud. Instead, I used the pressure points my mother had taught me, pressing firmly against the nerve cluster at the base of his neck. The growl died in his throat. His muscles relaxed, just a fraction. "The poison is deep," I said, more to myself than to him. "But it hasn't reached the bone." Not yet. I spent the next 3 hours in a blur of motion. I used the boiling water to clean the rusted instruments as best I could. I used the gritty salve, not as a cure, but as a base, mixing it with the scrapings of moss I found growing in the damp corners of the room, a trick for drawing out heat that the southern Pax had forgotten centuries ago. I worked with a cold, clinical focus that blocked out the screams and the stench. I moved from slab to slab, stitching torn flesh, resetting shattered bone, and using my own limited supply of clean water to flush out the worst of the infections. I felt the eyes on me. The healers stopped their own work to watch the way I handled the needle, The way I found the hidden pockets of rot that their diluted solutions had missed. They didn't speak to me, but the air in the room changed. The jagged edge of hostility softened into a tense, watchful silence. Adrian appeared in the doorway sometime after midnight. He didn't enter the room. He stood in the shadows, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his golden eyes tracking my every move. He watched as I finished bandaging a young scout's leg, my fingers moving with a precision that belied the bone-deep exhaustion settling into my limbs. Adrian stood in cold, heavy silence, offering neither a word of help nor a flicker of encouragement. He merely watched, his gaze that of a predator evaluating the efficiency of a new tool. I looked up, my eyes meeting his across the crowded, suffering room. I didn't look away. I wanted him to see the blood on my hands. I wanted him to see the cost of his honest cage. He stayed for 10 minutes, then vanished back into the dark of the hallway. He never watched a healer work before, a voice rasped from the next slab. I turned. It was an older wolf, his face a map of scars, one eye clouded over by a silver burn. He was watching me with a strange, unsettling intensity. He doesn't care about the healing, I said, wiping my hands on a damp cloth. He only cares about the results. In Frosthold, they're the same thing, the old wolf countered. He gestured to the man I had first treated, who was now breathing in a deep, rhythmic sleep. That pressure trick, haven't seen it used right in years. You've got the hands of a real healer, girl. Not like these butchers who only know how to pour diluted moonstone on a rot they don't understand. I'm just doing what I was taught, I said, my voice tight. There is no such thing as just being taught in the borderlands, he whispered. You're either a miracle or a curse. And the king is still deciding which one you are. Before I could respond, a sound erupted from the very back of the infirmary. A sound that made every wolf in the room freeze. The sound that erupted from the darkness was a hollow, metallic roar, transcending anything as human as a growl or a scream. It sounded as if the mountain itself were cracking open under the weight of some ancient grief, the vibration rattling the stone floor beneath my feet. The room went deathly silent. The healers stopped mid-motion, their faces turning ashen. Mara, who had been sharpening her spear near the entrance, went rigid, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the shaft. He waking up, someone whispered, the words barely audible over the sudden, frantic clanking of heavy chains from the depths of the confinement area. Adrian appeared in the doorway again, but this time he didn't stay in the shadows. He stepped into the light, his expression a mask of cold, disciplined iron. Ignoring the wounded and sparing not even a glance for me, he looked only toward the heavy, iron-bound door at the far end of the chamber, where the shadows seemed to be thickening. The roar came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of stone shattering and the screech of silver chains being strained to their breaking point. Adrian's hand went to the hilt of his blackened blade, his golden eyes narrowing as he stared into the dark. Mara, he said, his voice a low, flat line that cut through the rising panic. Get the silver-tipped bolts. And clear the floor. I stood my ground, my heart hammering against my ribs, as the air in the infirmary grew cold. A different kind of cold than the winter outside. The cold of a grave being opened. I looked at Adrian, then at the door to the depths, and I realized that the honest cage was about to get a lot more dangerous. The silence that followed Adrian's command was heavier than the roar that had preceded it. It was a silence born of practiced dread, the kind that settled over a pack when they realized the predator wasn't outside the walls, but breathing among them. Mara didn't hesitate. She signaled to two other guards, their faces grim as they hauled a heavy crate of silver-tipped bolts toward the back of the room. The other healers retreated, their movements frantic as they cleared the floor, leaving a wide, empty space between the main infirmary and the iron-bound door that still shuddered under the force of an unseen blow. I didn't move. I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the man I had just treated, the one with the obsidian spiderwebs crawling up his arm. You're not clearing the floor, I said, my voice sounding thin in the cavernous room. I looked at Adrian, who was still standing by the entrance, his hand resting with deceptive casualness on his sword hilt. You're clearing a kill zone. Adrian's gaze shifted to me. The gold in his eyes seemed to burn brighter in the dim torchlight, a cold, predatory fire. In Frosthold, the line between a patient and a threat is drawn in silver. When they cross it, we don't heal. We terminate. He hasn't crossed it yet, I countered, gesturing to the sleeping warrior. The rot is slow. If you had pure moonstone solution. We don't, Adrian interrupted, his voice a flat, dangerous rasp. He stepped into the room, his presence pushing the air out of my lungs. He walked past the rows of slabs, his eyes scanning the wounded with a clinical detachment that made my skin crawl. The border veins have been coughing up poison for months. The caravans from the south are delayed by politics and snow. We make do with what the mountain gives us, and the mountain is giving us poison. He stopped beside the man I had treated. He looked down at the bandaged arm, then at the bowl of gray salve and moss I had used. Mineral rot isn't just a disease, Omega, he said, his voice dropping to a low murmur that only I could hear. It's a mutation. The moonstones are the lifeblood of our kind, but when they are corrupted by the deep earth veins, they turn the wolf against the flesh. It starts with the blood, then the marrow, and finally, the soul. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering over the warrior's chest. Tell me, healer. You saw the black veins. You felt the heat. How long until the obsidian reaches his heart? I stepped closer, forced by a sudden, stubborn need to prove I wasn't just some soft southern Omega to be discarded. I picked up the jar of diluted moonstone solution Mara had left behind. I unscrewed the lid and held it under Adrian's nose. This solution is at least 60% river water, I said, my voice steadying. And the base isn't even moonstone dust, it's crushed quartz with a trace of lunar residue. You're not just failing to heal them, Adrian. You're accelerating the rot. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Explain. The mineral rot feeds on instability, I said, the old infirmary texts my mother had made me memorize rushing back to me. When you apply a weak, unstable solution, the body tries to bond with it, but the impurities in the quartz create a chemical friction. It's like trying to put out a grease fire with a damp cloth. You're just spreading the heat. I moved away from him, walking toward the next slab where a young scout lay. His leg was bound in filthy, reused linen that had been washed so many times it was more gray than white. I began to unwrap the bandage, ignoring the scout's pained hiss. Look at this, I commanded, not caring if I sounded arrogant. This is the second stage. See the way the skin around the wound has turned translucent, almost like parchment? That's the mineral leaching the moisture from the cells. And these black lines, they aren't just on the surface. They're crystalline. If I were to cut into this vein right now, I wouldn't find blood. I'd find a slurry of obsidian shards. I leaned in closer, checking the scout's eyes. Look at his pupils. See the faint, golden fractures at the edges of the iris? That's the sign that the rot has reached the optic nerve. In the south, we call it the gilded blindness. It means he has less than 48 hours before the wolf's soul begins to fracture. Adrian followed me, his heavy boots thudding against the stone. He looked at the scout, then back at me, his expression unreadable. And your solution, Southern Healer? If our moonstones are poison, what would you use? Prayers? Lavender? I would use science, I snapped. I walked to the central supply table, a scarred wooden slab covered in rusted instruments and jars of cloudy, foul-smelling liquids. I picked up a pair of forceps, they were pitted with rust, the hinges grinding as I forced them open. You expect us to heal warriors with tools that would give a healthy man lockjaw, I said, dropping the forceps back onto the table with a clatter. The first thing I need is a concentrated alkaline base. The mineral rot is acidic, it eats through the alkaline balance of a werewolf's blood. If you neutralize the acidity first, the moonstone solution doesn't have to fight the environment. It can focus on the marrow. I picked up a jar of the gray salve. And your ratios are all wrong. You're using 3 parts silver nitrate to 1 part lunar salt. You think the silver will kill the infection, but in this concentration, it only cauterizes the healthy tissue, trapping the rot underneath where it can fester in the dark. It should be the reverse. 1 part silver to 3 parts salt. The salt draws the mineral out, the silver only seals the exit. A tense silence stretched between us. I could feel Mara's icy stare from across the room, her hand tightening on the shaft of her spear. The other healers had stopped their work entirely, watching us with a mixture of terror and desperate, hidden hope. Adrian didn't move for a long moment. He stood there, a mountain of a man draped in shadows and fur, evaluating me with a clinical detachment that was more terrifying than his anger. He wasn't just listening to my words, he was testing the weight of my soul, looking for the crack that would prove I was as weak as the South believed. You speak of herbs, he said, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. Tell me, Omega. If I gave you the run of my stores, if I gave you every scrap of salt and silver I have left, could you stop the rot in that man? He pointed to an older warrior in the corner. The man was barely conscious, his chest heaving with a wet, rattling sound. The black veins had reached his neck, crawling up toward his jawline like a strangler's hand. I walked over to the man. I didn't need to touch him to feel the heat radiating from his skin, a dry, searing heat that smelled of burnt stone. I looked at his eyes. The golden fractures were no longer just at the edges, they were spreading across the entire iris, turning his gaze into a shattered mirror. No, I said, my voice heavy. It's too late for him. The rot has reached the spinal column. If I tried to draw it out now, the shock would shatter his nervous system. He would die in agony before the first drop of solution touched his blood. Adrian stepped up behind me. Then what would you do? I would give him peace, I whispered. And I would use the remaining ghost leaf to ensure he doesn't turn before the end. But for the others, for the ones where the black hasn't crossed the shoulder, I could save them. If you let me. Adrian's hand went to the hilt of his sword. For a second, I thought he was going to strike me. But he only tightened his grip, his knuckles turning white. In the borderlands, we do not have the luxury of peace, he said. Every man who can hold a blade must stand. If he cannot stand, he is a liability. And we do not keep liabilities in Frosthold. Then you are a fool, I said, the words out of my mouth before I could stop them. A warrior who knows he will be terminated the moment he falters will never fight with his whole heart. He will fight with fear. And fear is the fastest way to let the rot in. Adrian's eyes flared. He stepped into my space, his presence so overwhelming I had to fight the urge to stumble back. He smelled of deep forest and old blood, a scent that was both grounding and utterly terrifying. You think you can lecture me on the hearts of my men, he hissed, his face inches from mine. You, who lived in a palace of silk and lies. You, who were traded like a piece of livestock to settle a debt. I was traded because I was the only one who knew how to keep your livestock alive, I shot back. And if you want to see the reality of your borderlands, look at your own hands, Adrian. How many of your friends have you put down because you didn't have the right ratio of salt? The air in the room seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping until I could see my own breath. Adrian didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared at me, his golden eyes searching mine for a long, agonizing minute. Then he stepped back. Mara, he barked, not taking his eyes off me. Yes, Alpha? Mara stepped forward, her expression a mask of cold obedience. Watch her. If she so much as touches a jar without your supervision, or if a single man dies from anything other than the rot, you will gut her yourself. Do you understand? Yes, Alpha, Mara said, her voice tight with suppressed rage, her eyes fixed on me with a promise of violence. Adrian turned back to me, his expression returning to that mask of disciplined iron. You speak with the arrogance of a healer, Claire of Bloodclaw. But in Frosthold, arrogance is a death sentence if it isn't backed by results. He turned on his heel and strode toward the back of the infirmary, his cloak swirling around his boots like a shadow. Wait, I called out, my voice echoing against the damp stone. He stopped, but didn't turn. What about the roar? I asked, gesturing toward the iron-bound door at the far end of the chamber, the one that was still vibrating with a low, rhythmic thrum. If you're so concerned about efficiency, why is that man still breathing? Why waste the silver on someone you've already given up on? Adrian stood still for a long moment. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant, metallic grinding from behind the door and the wet, rattling breaths of the dying. Because, Adrian said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout, he is the only one who knows what is coming from the north. And until he speaks, he is the most valuable liability I have. He looked back over his shoulder, a challenge glinting in his golden eyes, a cold, predatory light that seemed to see right through my southern pretenses. If you want to understand Frosthold, start with him. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and strode toward the iron-bound door at the back of the room, his heavy boots thudding against the stone. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking, a fine, rhythmic tremor I couldn't suppress. I forced them into fists. I took a deep breath, locked my fear away, and followed him into the dark. The air in the confinement area didn't just feel cold, it felt heavy, as if the shadows themselves had mass. As I followed Adrian past the iron-bound door, the flickering torchlight from the infirmary faded, replaced by the dim, sickly green luminescence of raw moonstone ore embedded in the walls. It was a low-grade light, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe against the damp stone. The further we descended, the more the mountain seemed to close in on us, the air growing thin and tasting of wet iron and ancient, stagnant dust. The sound was constant, now a low, rhythmic grinding of teeth against metal, punctuated by wet, ragged breaths that sounded more like a bellows than a man. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated suffering, the kind that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the marrow of my bones. "Stay behind me," Adrian commanded, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of an absolute decree. He didn't look back, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near the hilt of his blackened blade. This wasn't just a king visiting a prisoner. This was a predator entering the territory of something he no longer fully understood. We reached a second set of bars, these ones forged of heavy, reinforced silver that hummed with a faint, blue-white energy. Behind them lay a cell that looked more like a pit, carved directly into the living rock of the mountain. The floor was littered with shattered stone, the remains of what might have once been furniture, and dark, oily stains that I didn't want to identify. In the center of the pit, a figure was crouched. At first, I couldn't tell if it was a man or a wolf. He was massive, his back a landscape of corded muscle and jagged, obsidian-colored protrusions that broke through the skin like shards of volcanic glass. He was stripped to the waist, his skin a mottled gray, traced with the same black spiderwebs I had seen in the infirmary, but here, they were thick as ropes, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic light that seemed to sync with the grinding of his teeth. Heavy silver chains were bolted to the walls, their links glowing with a faint, blue-white heat where they touched his skin. He was anchored by his wrists, his ankles, and a thick collar around his neck that looked like it was designed to hold a dragon, not a man. The silver was eating into his flesh, the scent of burnt hair and ozone filling the small space. "Jax," Adrian said. The figure didn't move. The grinding sound stopped, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. "He has been like this for 3 days, Mara said, appearing in the shadows behind us. She didn't enter the light, but the glint of her crossbow was unmistakable. Her voice was tight, lacking its usual jagged edge of arrogance. For the first time, I heard something in her tone that sounded like genuine, bone-deep fear. The last time we tried to feed him, he nearly took off a guard's arm. The silver isn't holding him like it used to, Adrian. The rot has reached his spine. It's over." I stepped closer to the bars, my breath hitching in my throat. The scent hit me then, not just the rot, but something deeper, something primal. It was the smell of a dying star, a cold, metallic ozone that made the back of my throat ache and my eyes water. It was the scent of a wolf's soul being torn apart from the inside out. And then, I felt it. A sudden, sharp heat flared against my chest, so intense I almost cried out. The signet ring, the one my mother had hidden away from me, the one she had told me never to show anyone, was burning through my tunic. It wasn't the warm, comforting heat of a bond. It was a jagged, vibrating pulse, a frantic SOS that seemed to be screaming in response to the thing in the cage. I reached up, my fingers brushing the metal through the fabric. The vibration intensified, a low hum that seemed to sync with the pulsing black veins on the man's back. It was as if the ring were a tuning fork, and Jax was the broken instrument it was trying to align with. "He's not gone," a voice whispered in the back of my mind. It wasn't my own voice. It was something older, something tied to the blood and the ring, a memory of a power I didn't yet understand. "The wolf is screaming, but the man is still holding the door. He is fighting the dark, Claire. He is fighting for every breath." I looked at Jax, or the thing that had been Jax. His head was bowed, his long, matted hair obscuring his face. But as I watched, I saw the way his fingers clawed at the stone floor, the way his muscles jumped and twitched in a frantic, agonizing rhythm. He wasn't just a monster. He was a prisoner in his own skin, fighting a war that no one else could see, a war where the enemy was his own blood. "He is in pain," I said, my voice echoing in the small space. It sounded small, fragile against the weight of the mountain. "He is a ticking bomb," Mara snapped, her crossbow creaking as she tightened her grip. "One more link snaps, and he'll tear this level apart before we can put a bolt in him. We should have ended this weeks ago, Adrian. You're keeping a corpse on a leash." Adrian didn't answer her. He didn't even look at her. His eyes were fixed on Jax, his expression a mask of disciplined iron. But I saw the way his jaw was set, the way his own wolf soul was bristling in response to the alpha-level pressure coming from the pit. He wasn't just a king watching a soldier. He was a brother watching a brother drown. I ignored Mara. I moved toward the silver bars, my hand still clutching the ring through my tunic. The blue-white light of the silver made my skin look ghostly, the shadows of the bars stretching across my face like a cage. "Claire, get back," Adrian warned, his voice a low growl that vibrated in his chest. "He doesn't know friend from foe anymore. To him, you're just a scent he doesn't recognize." I didn't stop. I reached the bars and looked down into the pit. The air here was thick with the static of a pending transformation, the kind of energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Jax?" I whispered. The figure froze. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head. His face was a mask of agony, the features distorted by the pressure of the mineral rot. One eye was a clouded, milky white, the other a burning, turbulent gold that seemed to be fighting to stay focused. The black veins crawled across his cheeks, disappearing into his hairline, pulsing with that sickly obsidian light. He looked at me, and for a second, the gold eye cleared. I saw a flash of recognition, not of me, but of the scent I carried. Whatever scent I had released in the tower, faint as it was, seemed to cut through the fog of his madness like a beacon. It was a note of pure, clean winter air in a room full of rot. He let out a sound, not a roar, but a broken, jagged sob that tore through the silence. "Kill me," he rasped, the words tearing through his throat like shards of glass. He looked at Adrian, his one good eye pleading. "Adrian, please. Before I lose the door." Adrian's jaw tightened, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the hilt of his sword. "I can't do that, Jax. Not yet. You're the only one who saw the vanguard. You're the only one who knows what they're carrying." "It doesn't matter," Jax screamed, his body suddenly arching in a violent convulsion. The black veins on his back flared with a blinding, obsidian light, the protrusions of glass like mineral growing longer, sharper. The silver chains groaned, the link straining against the stone anchors. The very walls of the cell began to crack, dust and pebbles raining down from the ceiling. "He is turning!" Mara yelled, stepping into the light, her crossbow leveled at Jax's head. "Adrian, move! I have the shot." "No!" I screamed, throwing myself against the bars, my hands gripping the cold silver. "Wait! He is still in there." Jax's wolf soul erupted. It wasn't a physical transformation. Not yet. But it was a massive, spectral shadow of a wolf, wreathed in black smoke and silver sparks, that tore free from his body for a split second. It snapped at the air with jaws of pure shadow, its eyes two pits of burning gold. The pressure in the room doubled, the air becoming almost impossible to breathe. Crack. One of the silver chains, the one anchored to his left wrist, shattered under the force of the spectral eruption. The broken links whipped through the air, striking the stone walls with the force of bullets. Jax lunged. He moved with a speed that defied his size, a blur of gray skin and black glass. He hit the bars with the force of a falling mountain, the impact vibrating through my entire body. His remaining chains snapped taut, the silver collar biting deep into his neck, but his one free hand reached through the gaps in the bars. His claws, long and blackened by the rot, stopped inches from my throat. I could feel the heat radiating from them, the dry, searing heat of the mineral rot. I could see the way the black veins were pulsing under his skin, like a nest of vipers. The air was filled with the scent of ozone, blood, and that terrifying, metallic rot. I could feel the sheer, overwhelming pressure of his alpha-level wolf soul trying to crush mine, a weight that made my knees weak and my heart hammer a frantic, uneven rhythm. "Claire!" Adrian's voice was a roar, his sword clearing its scabbard with a sharp, metallic ring. He was moving toward me, but he was too far back, the space between us filled with the static of Jax's rage. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I stared into Jax's golden eye, and in that moment, I didn't see a beast. I saw a man drowning in a sea of black ink, a man who was using every ounce of his remaining strength to keep his claws from closing around my neck. He was shaking, his entire body vibrating with the effort of the restraint. The signet ring against my chest went from hot to searing, a pulse of energy that felt like a heartbeat. It was as if the ring were reaching out, trying to bridge the gap between my soul and his. Jax's free hand curled into a fist, his knuckles cracking against the silver bars. He let out a roar that shook the very foundations of Frosthold, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and grief that seemed to echo the pain of the mountain itself. And then, he lunged again, the silver bars groaning as he tried to pull me into the dark, his one good eye wide with a silent, desperate plea for help. The world narrowed to the space between the silver bars and the monster-esque claws. Jax's hand was a blur of blackened skin and jagged bone, his fingers curling around the bars with a strength that made the reinforced metal scream. I could feel the heat of his breath on my face, a humid, metallic stench that carried the weight of 1,000 dying wolves. The air in the confinement area was thick with the static of his rage, a physical pressure that made my skin crawl and my lungs ache for oxygen. "Claire, move." Adrian's voice was a thunderclap, a command that should have sent me scrambling back into the shadows. But my feet were rooted to the stone, my eyes locked on the turbulent gold of Jax's gaze. Mara's crossbow clicked a sharp, final sound in the echoing chamber. It was the sound of a death sentence, the mechanical precursor to a silver bolt through the heart. I didn't move back. Instead, I did the one thing every instinct in my body told me not to do. I reached through the bars. My fingers brushed the pulse point on Jax's free wrist. The contact was like touching a live wire. A jolt of pure, obsidian-laced agony shot up my arm, cold enough to burn and sharp enough to make my vision fracture. The dim green light of the cell exploded into 1,000 shards of white, the world tilting on its axis as the mineral rot in Jax's blood tried to bridge the gap into mine. And then, it happened. The signet ring against my chest flared once, sharp and painful, a needle of heat that pierced through my tunic and into my skin. It came as a thread, thin, cold, and impossibly clean, slipping from my skin and wrapping around the pulse beneath my fingers. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't a technique. It was a desperate, instinctive reach for a soul that was already half drowned in a sea of black ink. The thread was a lifeline, a note of pure, crystalline clarity that cut through the static of Jax's madness. The scent followed not a suffocating cloud, but a sharp, crystalline note of cold stone, old earth, and clean winter air. It was a touch, not a command, a whisper of the frozen peaks and the silent, moonlit snow. It was the scent of the borderlands themselves, stripped of the rot and the blood. Jax's roar died in his throat. His body, which had been a coiled spring of violence, went slack. The spectral wolf shadow that had been tearing at the air vanished as if it had never been, the pressure in the room dissipating like a broken fever. He slumped against the bars, his forehead resting against the cold silver, his breath coming in long, shuddering gasps that sounded more human than beast. What did you do?" Mara's voice was trembling, her crossbow wavering as she stared at the scene. She looked from Jax to me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a new, jagged kind of suspicion. She took a half step back, her boots grinding against the stone floor, as if the very air around me had become toxic. To her, I wasn't just a healer anymore. I was an anomaly, a variable that didn't fit into the brutal, predictable equations of the borderlands. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My head was spinning, a sharp, stabbing pain blooming behind my eyes that felt like a silver needle being driven into my brain. The world began to pulse in time with the throbbing in my temples, the dim green light of the moonstone stretching and warping until the walls of the cell seemed to be melting. I felt something warm and wet trickle from my nose, and when I wiped it with my free hand, my fingers came away stained with dark, thick blood that looked almost black in the dim green light, heavy with the metallic tang of overexertion. 3 seconds, the voice in my head whispered, a cold, distant echo of my mother's teachings. You have 3 seconds of mercy before the dark rushes back in. Use them, Claire. Use them or die. I didn't waste them. I reached into the small pouch at my waist, the one Mara hadn't managed to take during her inspection. I pulled out a single, long silver needle and a crushed wad of ghost leaf I had hidden in the lining of my tunic, a last resort survival kit I had prepared in the tower. I didn't have time for a mortar and pestle. I shoved the leaf into the open wound on Jax's wrist, the one where the chain had shattered the skin and the black veins were weeping that oily, dark fluid. He let out a low, pained whimper, a sound that broke my heart, but he didn't pull away. He didn't even flinch. I took the silver needle and drove it into the nerve cluster at the base of his thumb, twisting it with a precision that came from years of muscle memory and the desperate need to survive. I could feel the resistance of the mineral rot, the way the crystals in his blood tried to deflect the needle, but I pushed through, my fingers steady despite the tremor in my soul. Neutralize the acidity, I whispered, my voice sounding like it was coming from underwater, the words thick and heavy in my mouth. Stop the friction. Let the leaf take the heat, Jax. Let it draw the poison out. I felt the thread of scent begin to recede, the faint warmth in my veins flickering and dying like a candle in a storm. The cold of the mountain rushed back in, twice as sharp as before, a bone-deep chill that made my teeth chatter and my skin turn a sickly, translucent gray. My body began to shake, a deep, rhythmic tremor that I couldn't control. Jack's golden eye opened. It wasn't the turbulent, mad gold of the beast anymore. It was clear. Human. A deep, amber gold that reminded me of the sun hitting the autumn leaves in the southern forests. He looked at me, his gaze traveling from my blood-stained face to the hand still holding his wrist. He didn't see an omega to be discarded. He didn't see a prisoner to be feared. He saw a lifeline, fragile and temporary, but real. You, he rasped, his voice a broken shadow of what it must have once been, a sound of gravel and grief. Don't fight it, I said, my voice cracking, my vision beginning to blur at the edges. The needle is holding the door. Let the leaf take the heat. Just, breathe. He reached out with his free hand, his fingers brushing my sleeve. His touch was surprisingly gentle, the blackened claws retracted just enough not to tear the fabric. It was a gesture of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that he was still inside the beast. Don't, he whispered, his head lolling to the side as the exhaustion of the transformation and the sudden, violent cooling of his blood finally claimed him. Don't, let me turn. Not, again. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he slumped to the floor of the pit, the remaining silver chains clanking softly as they took his weight. He looked smaller now, less like a monster and more like a man who had been through a war and lost everything but his life. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, ringing silence that felt like the aftermath of an explosion. I stood there for a moment, my hand still reaching through the bars, my fingers numb and stained with Jack's dark blood. The silence of the confinement area was no longer heavy. It was hollow, as if the very soul of the mountain had been sucked out. The world was tilting, the stone walls beginning to blur into a gray haze, the flickering green light of the moonstones turning into a series of dancing sparks that threatened to swallow my vision entirely. I felt a hand on my shoulder, heavy, firm, and unmistakably Adrian's. The heat of his palm through my thin tunic was the only thing anchoring me to the floor. Claire. His voice was low, stripped of its usual iron authority, carrying a note of something I couldn't quite identify. Was it wonder, or was it the cold calculation of a man who had just found a weapon more powerful than any sword? I tried to turn, to look at him, to see the expression on his face, but my legs gave out. The strength that had been holding me up, the adrenaline and the strange, golden power of the ring, vanished in an instant, leaving me as hollow as the room around me. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was Adrian's face. His golden eyes were wide, the pupils blown, his expression a chaotic mixture of shock, disbelief, and something that looked dangerously like fear. He wasn't looking at a prisoner anymore. He was looking at something he couldn't control, something that didn't fit into his world of silver and steel. I had pulled the beast back from the edge. But as the cold settled into my marrow and the darkness rushed in to meet me, I wondered if I had enough left to save myself from the king who now knew exactly what I was capable of. The darkness wasn't empty. It was filled with the scent of cold stone and clean winter air and the sound of a wolf howling in the distance, a sound that was no longer a scream of rage, but a long, lonely cry for home. The darkness was not a void, it was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smelled of old iron and damp stone. When I finally opened my eyes, the world was a blurred, spinning canvas of gray and sickly green. I was no longer on the floor of the confinement area. I was lying on a narrow, hard cot in what looked like a small storage room off the main infirmary. The air was freezing, biting through my thin tunic and raising goosebumps on my skin. My entire body ached, a deep, throbbing pain that radiated from my bones, as if I had been beaten with a hammer. But the worst pain was in my right wrist. I tried to lift my hand, but a sharp, agonizing jolt shot up my arm, forcing a gasp from my lips. I looked down. My wrist was wrapped in a clean, white linen bandage, but beneath the cloth, I could see the faint, dark outline of the mineral rot. The brief contact with Jack's blood had been enough. The rot had kissed the surface, not taken root. Not yet. Don't move it. The voice came from the shadows near the door. Low. Rough. Completely devoid of sympathy. Adrian stepped into the dim light of the single torch burning on the wall. He had discarded his heavy fur cloak, wearing only a dark, fitted tunic that highlighted the sheer, intimidating breadth of his shoulders. His golden eyes were fixed on me, calculating and cold, like a jeweler assessing a flawed gem. "You bought yourself a few days, Omega," he said, walking toward the cot. His boots made no sound on the stone floor. "The rot in your wrist is superficial for now. It hasn't reached the vein. But it will, if you don't keep your heart rate down." I tried to sit up, my head swimming with vertigo. "Jax, is he?" "He is breathing," Adrian interrupted, stopping beside the cot. He looked down at me, his expression unreadable. "His temperature has dropped. The black veins have receded from his neck. He is not cured, but he is no longer a ticking bomb." He reached out and grabbed my injured wrist. I flinched, a sharp hiss escaping my teeth as his large, calloused fingers pressed against the bandage. His touch was not gentle. It was clinical, precise, and entirely focused on assessing the damage. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He didn't apologize for the pain. He simply turned my wrist, examining the dark lines beneath the linen. "You used ghost leaf and silver," he stated, his eyes flicking up to meet mine. "A dangerous combination. The leaf draws the heat, but the silver traps the rot. If you had missed the nerve cluster by a fraction of an inch, you would have paralyzed his hand permanently." "I didn't miss," I said, my voice raspy and weak, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. "And if I hadn't done it, you would have had to put a bolt through his heart." Adrian's jaw tightened. He dropped my wrist and stepped back. "You took a risk with an asset that does not belong to you. In Frosthold, we do not gamble with the lives of our vanguard." "You were already gambling with his life," I shot back, the anger cutting through my exhaustion. "You chained him to a wall and waited for him to turn. You call that strategy?" "I call it cowardice." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Adrian's eyes flared, the golden irises burning with a sudden, predatory intensity. He leaned over the cot, his face inches from mine, his alpha presence pressing down on me like a physical weight. "Watch your tongue, Southern healer," he whispered, his voice a dangerous rumble. "You are alive right now because you proved useful. Do not mistake utility for immunity. I can still throw you back into the snow." I didn't look away. My heart hammered against my ribs, fear cold and sharp in my chest, but I refused to let him see it. I had survived Ryan's indifference. I had survived the borderlands. I would not be cowed by a king who needed me more than he was willing to admit. "Then throw me," I challenged, my voice steadying. "Throw me out, and watch Jack's turn. Watch the rest of your men rot from the inside out because your healers don't know the difference between a cure and a cauterization." Adrian stared at me for a long, tense moment. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken threats and the bitter reality of our situation. He was a king who ruled by strength and fear, and I was an Omega who had just defied both. But he didn't strike me. He didn't call for the guards. Slowly, he straightened, the dangerous intensity in his eyes fading back into that cold, calculating detachment. He was evaluating me again, weighing my words against the desperate needs of his fortress. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice flat. "I want what I need to keep him alive," I said, pushing myself into a sitting position and ignoring the throbbing in my head. "I need clean water. Not river water, boiled water. I need access to your herb stores, whatever is left of them. I need silver needles, properly sterilized. And I need moonstone powder. Not the diluted garbage Mara is using, but pure powder." Adrian crossed his arms over his chest. "The pure powder is reserved for the Alpha Guard. It is strictly rationed." "Then unration it," I demanded. "Jax's rot is deep in the marrow. The ghost leaf only bought him time. If I don't start a proper alkaline flush within the next 12 hours, the rot will adapt, and the next time he turns, nothing will bring him back." Adrian's expression didn't change, but I saw a slight tightening around his eyes. He knew I was right. He knew the cost of losing Jax. "You will have your water and your herbs," Adrian said finally, his tone indicating that the negotiation was over. "I will authorize a small ration of pure moonstone powder. But you will not work alone." "I don't need Mara breathing down my neck," I argued. "You will have guards," Adrian continued, ignoring my protest. "2 of them, at all times. They will watch every move you make. If you try to hoard the powder, if you try to sabotage the treatment, or if Jax's condition worsens because of your methods." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The threat hung in the air, cold and absolute. Fine, I said, my voice tight. But I need to see him now. The ghost leaf needs to be changed. You will rest for 2 hours, Adrian commanded. If you collapse while treating him, you are of no use to me. He turned and walked toward the door. Adrian, I called out before he could leave. He stopped, looking back over his shoulder. If you continue to treat your healers like prisoners and your warriors like broken tools, I said, my voice quiet but firm, you won't need the ferals to destroy Frosthold. You'll do it yourself. Adrian didn't answer. He simply stared at me for a second, his golden eyes unreadable in the dim light, before stepping out into the corridor and pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind him. I was left alone in the cold, damp room. I let out a long, shaky breath, the adrenaline finally leaving my system, replaced by a crushing wave of exhaustion. I looked down at my bandaged wrist, the faint, dark lines of rot a grim reminder of the price I had paid. I had won the negotiation, but the victory felt hollow. I was still a prisoner. I was still surrounded by enemies. And I was now infected with the very disease I was trying to cure. I lay back down on the hard cot, pulling my thin tunic tighter around my shivering shoulders. I closed my eyes, trying to force my mind to rest, trying to ignore the throbbing pain in my wrist and the cold, creeping dread in my stomach. A few minutes later, the door creaked open. I tensed, expecting Mara or one of the guards. But no one entered. I sat up and looked toward the door. On the small wooden stool just inside the room, someone had left a small, unmarked clay jar. I swung my legs over the side of the cot and walked over to the stool, my bare feet freezing against the stone floor. I picked up the jar and unscrewed the lid. The scent of crushed willow bark and winter mint filled the air, a potent, high-grade numbing salve, the kind used for deep bone pain. It was fresh, the herbs perfectly balanced, the texture smooth and clean. There was no note. No explanation. I looked out into the empty, shadowed corridor, but there was no one there. I walked back to the cot, holding the small jar in my uninjured hand. I didn't know if it was a reward for saving Jax, or simply a practical measure to ensure I could still work. With Adrian, it was impossible to tell. He was a king who dealt in utility, not compassion. But as I carefully rubbed the soothing salve over my aching wrist, the sharp, biting pain began to dull, replaced by a cool, numbing relief. It wasn't a gesture of kindness. It was a transaction. A cold, calculated investment in a tool he needed. But in the borderlands, I was quickly learning. A transaction was the closest thing to mercy you were ever going to get. The 2 hours Adrian had given me felt like 2 minutes. When the heavy wooden door of the storage room creaked open, I was already sitting on the edge of the cot, my satchel packed with the meager supplies I had managed to salvage. 2 guards stood in the doorway. They were massive, scarred men who looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and grudging curiosity. They didn't speak, simply gesturing for me to follow them. We walked back through the main infirmary. The atmosphere had changed. The frantic, desperate energy of the previous night had settled into a tense, watchful silence. The other healers and wounded warriors tracked my movements, their eyes lingering on the clean white bandage wrapped around my wrist. They knew what I had done. They knew I had touched the rot and survived. We descended back into the lower levels, the air growing colder and heavier with every step. The sickly green light of the raw moonstone cast long, distorted shadows against the damp stone walls. When we reached the confinement area, Mara was already there. She stood outside the silver bars of Jax's cell, her crossbow lowered but still gripped tightly in her hands. She looked at me as I approached, her expression a mask of cold, jagged resentment. "You're wasting your time," she said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "He is quiet now, but the rot is still in his blood. He'll turn again. It's only a matter of time." I ignored her, stepping up to the bars. Jax was lying on the floor of the pit, exactly where he had fallen. The heavy silver chains were still bolted to his wrists and ankles, but the violent, blue-white heat of the metal had faded to a dull, pulsing glow. The black veins on his skin had receded significantly, no longer pulsing with that sickly obsidian light. He looked less like a monster and more like a man who had been broken on a wheel. "Open the cell," I said, turning to the guards. Mara stepped in front of the door, blocking my path. "Adrian said you could treat him. He didn't say you could go inside. You can pass the herbs through the bars." I need to change the dressing on his wrist, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. I need to check his pulse and his pupils. I can't do that through the bars. Then he doesn't get checked, Mara snapped. I'm not risking my men to open that door for a Southern Omega who thinks she is a miracle worker. Open it. The voice didn't come from me, or from the guards. It came from the pit. Rough. Gravelly. Unmistakably human. Mara froze, her eyes widening as she looked past me. Jax was sitting up. He moved slowly, his massive muscles trembling with the effort, the heavy silver chains clanking against the stone floor. He leaned back against the wall of the cell, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. His golden eye, the one that wasn't clouded by the rot, was fixed on Mara. It wasn't the turbulent, mad gold of the beast anymore. It was clear, focused, and burning with a cold, lethal intensity. I said, Jax rasped, his voice gaining a fraction of its former strength, open the door, Mara. Mara's grip on her crossbow tightened. You're infected, Jax. You're a liability. I take my orders from the Alpha, not from a corpse on a leash. Jax let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the scream of a feral. It was the warning of an Alpha-level warrior who had just remembered how to fight. Adrian gave her permission to treat me, Jax said, his gaze shifting to the two guards standing behind me. Are you going to disobey a direct order from your king because your commander is afraid of a healer? The guards exchanged an uneasy look. They knew Jax. They knew what he had been before the rot took him. He had been the vanguard, the first line of defense, the man who had bled more for Frosthold than anyone else in the fortress. One of the guards stepped forward, pulling a heavy iron key from his belt. He ignored Mara's furious glare and unlocked the heavy silver door, pulling it open with a loud, metallic groan. 2 minutes, the guard said, his voice gruff. If he twitches, we pull you out and lock it down. I didn't wait for him to change his mind. I slipped through the narrow opening and stepped into the cell. The air inside was thick with the smell of ozone, old blood, and the sharp, bitter scent of the ghost leaf I had used the night before. I knelt beside Jax, my knees hitting the cold stone floor. He looked at me, his golden eye tracking my movements. He didn't look like a monster up close. He looked exhausted, his face lined with pain and the deep, hollow shadows of a man who had been fighting a war inside his own mind. You came back, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the clanking of his chains. I told you I would, I said, opening my satchel and pulling out a clean linen bandage and a small jar of the pure moonstone powder Adrian had authorized. I reached for his injured wrist, the one where the chain had shattered the skin. He flinched slightly as my fingers brushed his arm, but he didn't pull away. I carefully unwrapped the makeshift bandage I had applied the night before. The wound was ugly, the edges jagged and blackened by the rot, but the ghost leaf had done its job. The deep, searing heat of the infection had cooled, and the black fluid weeping from the veins had slowed to a sluggish trickle. This is going to hurt, I warned him, picking up a small, sterilized silver needle. I've had worse, he grunted, his jaw tightening. I worked quickly, my hand steady despite the fear still lingering in the back of my mind. I used the needle to carefully scrape away the necrotic tissue, clearing the path for the moonstone powder. Jax didn't make a sound, though I could feel the muscles in his arm trembling with the effort of suppressing the pain. Why did you do it? He asked suddenly, his voice low. I paused, looking up at him. Do what? Reach through the bars, he said, his golden eye searching my face. You knew what I was. You knew what the rot does. You could have let Mara shoot me. It would have been safer. I'm a healer, I said simply, returning my focus to his wrist. I don't let people die if I can save them. You're from the south, he countered. Bloodclaw. You were raised in silk and sunlight. You don't belong in the dark. I belong where I choose to belong, I said, my voice hardening. I sprinkled a generous pinch of the pure moonstone powder into the cleaned wound. The powder hissed as it made contact with the rot, a faint, blue-white smoke rising from his skin. Jax let out a sharp hiss of pain, his hand curling into a fist, but he forced himself to relax. You think the poison only bites men like me? He asked, his voice dropping to a whisper only I could hear. I stopped, the small jar of powder hovering over his wrist. I looked at him, my heart skipping a beat. What do you mean? Jax's gaze shifted toward the open door of the cell, where Mara and the guards were watching us intently. He leaned in closer, the heavy silver collar around his neck scraping against the stone. "The rot doesn't care if you're a vanguard or a king," he murmured, his breath warm against my cheek. "It just looks for the strongest soul to break. Adrian thinks he can control it. He thinks his will is stronger than the mountain." He looked back at me, his expression grim. "Watch his sword hand when he thinks no one is looking." The words hit me like a physical blow. I thought back to the infirmary, to the way Adrian had held his sword, the grip too tight, the knuckles white, as if he were fighting a tremor he refused to acknowledge. I remembered the shadows under his eyes, the cold, rigid control that felt less like discipline and more like a dam holding back a flood. Adrian. The king of the borderlands. If he was infected. If the rot had reached the alpha. Frosthold wasn't just a fortress under siege. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. "Time us up," Mara's voice snapped from the doorway, sharp and impatient. "Get out of the cell, Omega." I quickly finished wrapping the clean linen bandage around Jax's wrist, securing it tightly. I packed my supplies back into the satchel and stood up. "I'll be back in 6 hours to check the alkaline flush," I told him, my voice professional, though my mind was racing with the implications of what he had just told me. Jax looked up at me, his golden eye clear and steady. He didn't say thank you. In the borderlands, gratitude was a luxury no one could afford. Instead, he looked past me, his gaze locking onto Mara. "Mara," he said, his voice carrying the heavy, resonant authority of a vanguard commander. Mara stiffened, her hand tightening on her crossbow. "What?" "She pulled me back," Jax said, his voice cold and absolute. He wasn't making a request. He was stating a fact, a law of the borderlands that superseded rank and title. "Until I repay that debt, anyone who touches her goes through me." The silence in the confinement area was deafening. The two guards shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Jax and Mara. Mara's face flushed with anger, her lips parting in a silent snarl, but she didn't argue. She knew the weight of a life dead in Frosthold. It was a bond forged in blood and survival, stronger than any chain or command. "Get out," Mara spat, glaring at me. I didn't hesitate. I stepped out of the cell, the heavy silver door slamming shut behind me with a resounding clang. I walked back up the dark, winding corridor, the guards trailing silently behind me. My wrist throbbed, a dull, persistent ache that reminded me of the poison in my own veins. I had survived another day. I had secured a powerful, albeit broken, ally. But as I thought about Jax's words, the cold dread in my stomach deepened. The king was infected. The fortress was crumbling from the inside out. And I was trapped in the middle of it, armed with nothing but a few silver needles and a ring that tasted of ancient moonlight. The air in the Alpha S suite was thick, heavy, and suffocating. Ryan stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the sprawling territory of Bloodclaw. The blizzard that had raged for 3 days had finally broken, leaving behind a pristine, glittering landscape of white. It was a beautiful sight, a testament to the wealth and stability of his pack. But Ryan couldn't appreciate it. His skin felt too tight, his muscles coiled with a restless, jagged energy that he couldn't shake. He was in the early stages of his pre-rut instability. It was a natural cycle for an alpha, a time when the wolf soul demanded dominance, territory, and, above all, its mate. Usually, this was a time of intense focus and heightened senses, anchored by the calming presence of the Luna. But this time, the anchor was gone. Ryan rubbed his chest, right over his sternum, where the phantom ache of the severed bond still throbbed. It wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was a dull, persistent hollow, like a missing tooth that his tongue couldn't stop probing. "Where is she?" His wolf growled, pacing the cage of his mind with frantic, aggressive energy. "Find the scent. Find the mate." "She is not the mate," Ryan muttered, his voice tight. "Sarah is the Luna I chose." As if summoned by his words, the heavy oak doors of the suite opened. Sarah swept into the room, her presence preceded by the sharp, aggressive scent of jasmine and crushed roses. She was dressed in a stunning gown of deep crimson silk, her dark hair perfectly coiffed, every inch the picture of a powerful, aristocratic Luna. "Ryan," she said, her voice smooth and confident. "The elders are waiting in the war room. The North Reach caravan is still delayed, and they want an update on the Moonstone reserves." Ryan turned to face her. He tried to summon the feeling of triumph he had felt on the night of the ceremony, the satisfaction of securing the most powerful alliance in the hemisphere. But as Sarah stepped closer, her scent hit him like a physical blow. It was too sharp. Too loud. It didn't soothe the jagged edges of his pre-red anxiety. It aggravated them. His wolf recoiled, a low, warning snarl vibrating in the back of his throat. Wrong, the beast snapped. Wrong scent. Wrong blood. Ryan forced the snarl down, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached. Tell the elders I will be down shortly. I need a moment. Sarah frowned, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together. She stepped closer, reaching out to touch his arm. Ryan, you've been distant since the ceremony. If the severance is still bothering you, my father's healers can. Do not touch me, Ryan snapped, stepping back before her fingers could make contact. The words were out before he could stop them, harsh and instinctual. Sarah froze, her hand hovering in the air, her expression shifting from concern to cold, aristocratic offense. I beg your pardon, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Ryan closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He was losing control. The stress of the missing moonstones, the delayed caravan, and the constant, maddening pacing of his wolf were fraying his nerves. I apologize, he said, forcing his voice to remain level. The pre-rut is difficult this cycle. The stress of the border veins is affecting my focus. I just need a moment alone. Sarah studied him for a long second, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't a fool. She could sense the instability in his aura, the chaotic, unanchored energy of an alpha without a true tether. Take your moment, Alpha, she said coldly. But do not keep the elders waiting long. They are already whispering about the empty vaults. They do not need to whisper about an unstable king. She turned and swept out of the room, the heavy doors closing behind her with a resounding thud. Ryan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The moment she was gone, his wolf stopped pacing, but the restless energy didn't fade. It simply shifted, turning its focus outward. Find her. Ryan turned back to the window. He looked toward the northern horizon, where the jagged, gray peaks of the borderlands pierced the sky. It had been 4 days. 4 days since Claire had walked out into the blizzard. He had given her 3 days to crawl back. He had expected to find her huddled at the gates, half frozen and begging for mercy. He had prepared his speech, the cold, magnanimous words he would use to grant her a place in the servants' quarters, proving to the pack that he was a just and merciful alpha. But she hadn't come back. The realization was a slow, creeping poison in his veins. It wasn't just that she had defied him. It was the sheer, impossible reality of her absence. Claire was an omega. She had no survival skills, no winter gear, no pack to protect her. She should be dead. But his wolf didn't feel the cold, absolute finality of death. It felt a void. A silence. Ryan turned away from the window and strode out of the suite. He didn't go to the war room. He didn't go to the elders. He walked down the long, echoing corridors of the pack house, his boots striking the marble floors with a heavy, aggressive rhythm. He didn't consciously choose his destination. His feet carried him there anyway. He pushed open the heavy wooden door of the servants' quarters and walked down the narrow, dimly lit hallway until he reached the small room at the very end. The room he had ordered prepared for Claire. He opened the door. The room was empty. The narrow bed was perfectly made, the thin wool blanket untouched. The small wooden wardrobe was bare. There was no scent of lavender and wild honey. There was nothing. Ryan stood in the doorway, his hands curling into fists. He had rejected her. He had thrown her away. She was a placeholder, a tool he had outgrown. He didn't want her. He didn't need her. So why did this empty room feel like a physical blow? Why did the silence feel like a scream? She left, his wolf snarled, the sound echoing in the hollow space of his chest. She took the anchor. She took the scent. She is nothing, Ryan whispered to the empty room, his voice trembling with a sudden, violent rage. She is a weak, useless omega. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the bare walls, the empty shelves. He was looking for something, a forgotten hairpin, a discarded ribbon, anything that proved she had been here, that she had existed in his world. But there was nothing. She had erased herself completely. The rage boiled over. It wasn't the cold, calculated anger of a king. It was the raw, primal fury of a beast that had been robbed of its possession. Ryan lunged forward, his fist slamming into the small wooden mirror hanging above the wash basin. The glass shattered, the sharp sound echoing loudly in the small room. Silver shards rained down onto the floor, reflecting the distorted, furious expression on his face. His knuckles were bleeding, but he didn't feel the pain. He only felt the crushing, suffocating weight of the silence. "How dare she?" Ryan hissed, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He stared at his fractured reflection in the remaining shards of glass. How dare she actually stay gone? He turned on his heel and strode out of the room, leaving the shattered mirror and the empty bed behind. He didn't want her back because he loved her. He told himself that with every step he took back toward the war room. He wanted her back because she belonged to Bloodclaw. She was his property, his subject, and she had no right to defy his command. And there was the matter of the moonstones. The timing was too perfect. The sudden instability of the border veins, the missing reserves in the vaults, and her impossible survival in the borderlands. She knew something. She had to. Ryan pushed open the doors to the war room. The elders stopped their whispering, turning to look at him. Sarah stood near the head of the table, her expression cool and composed. Vance stood by the map table, his face grim. Ryan didn't sit down. He walked straight to the map, his eyes locking onto the jagged line that marked the northern boundary. "Vance," Ryan commanded, his alpha voice ringing with absolute, unquestionable authority. "Yes, Alpha?" Vance stepped forward. "Assemble a tracking unit. The best we have. I want them at the northern border by nightfall." Sarah frowned, stepping forward. "Ryan, the border is unstable. We need our best trackers here, to secure the mines and find the missing moonstones." "The timing is connected to the Omega," Ryan said, his voice cold and hard. He didn't look at Sarah. He kept his eyes on the map, on the dark, uncharted territory of the borderlands. She spent 6 years in the infirmary. She knows more than she should. Her disappearance is not a coincidence. The elders exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to argue with the Alpha when his aura was this volatile. "What are the orders for the tracking unit, Alpha?" Vance asked, his voice carefully neutral. Ryan looked up, his amber eyes burning with a dark, obsessive light. "Send them to the northern roads." Quietly, Ryan said, the words tasting like ash and iron in his mouth. "I want reports on every traveler, every rogue camp, every frozen corpse they find. If she is alive, I want to know where." He looked back down at the map, his jaw set. She thought she could walk away. She thought she could survive without him. He would find out exactly where she was hiding. And then he would remind her who she belonged to. The descent into the central vaults of Bloodclaw was a journey into the Pack's very marrow, a place where the air usually hummed with the vibrant, blue-white resonance of raw power. It was the heartbeat of their territory, the source of the ancient wards that kept the ferals at bay and the mineral rot from taking root in their souls. But today, the heartbeat was a stuttering, dying thing. Ryan strode down the spiral stone staircase, his heavy boots striking the granite with a rhythmic, aggressive thud that echoed through the damp, lightless shaft. Behind him, the flickering torchlight carried by his guards cast long, distorted shadows against the walls, making the stone look as if it were bleeding shadows. He didn't need the light. His alpha senses were already screaming at the hollow space ahead, a void where there should have been a mountain of radiant energy. At the bottom of the stairs, a massive iron door, reinforced with silver filigree, stood ajar. Corin, the Pack's master of coin and keeper of the vaults, stood by the entrance. He was a thin, wiry beta who had served Ryan's father for decades, a man who lived for the cold precision of ledgers and the reassuring weight of silver. Today, however, Corin looked like a ghost. His face was ashen, his eyes sunken, and his hands trembled so violently that the heavy iron keys at his belt chimed like funeral bells. "Alpha," Corin whispered, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the frost-slicked stone floor. Ryan didn't acknowledge him. He pushed past the heavy door, the iron groaning on its hinges, and stepped into the main chamber. The vault was a cathedral of stone, designed to hold the wealth of a kingdom. Rows of reinforced stone shelves lined the walls, each one built to support the weight of high-purity moonstone crates. In the center of the room stood the great pedestal, a monolith of obsidian where the largest, most potent stones were kept to power the Pack's primary wards. The pedestal was empty. Ryan walked toward it, his eyes scanning the surrounding shelves. Most of them were bare, the dust on the stone showing the rectangular outlines where crates had once sat. A few crates remained in the shadows, but even from a distance, Ryan could see the dull, grayish hue of the stones inside. They weren't the vibrant, pulsing azure of high-grade ore. They were the sickly, translucent shade of slag-worthless rock that had been drained of its essence. "Where's the Northreach shipment?" Ryan asked, his voice dangerously soft, vibrating with a low-frequency growl that made the air in the vault feel heavy. Corin scurried forward, clutching a thick, leather-bound ledger to his chest as if it were a shield. The caravan arrived an hour ago, Alpha. We moved the crates directly to the sorting tables for inspection. But, it's a disaster. He gestured toward a small table near the back of the vault, where several stones had been laid out for evaluation. Ryan walked over and picked one up. It felt light in his hand. Brittle. Cold. There was no hum, no resonance. It was a dead rock, its surface marred by dark, oily streaks of mineral rot. 40% purity, Corin said, his voice wavering. At best. The caravan master said the primary veins in the Northreach mines have collapsed. The miners are refusing to go deeper. They say the earth is screaming, Alpha. They say the black fluid is rising from the core of the mountain like a tide. Ryan crushed the stone in his fist. It shattered into a fine, gray powder that coated his palm like ash. We pay the Northreach mines a fortune in silver and protection. If they cannot provide the ore, they are useless to me. Tell them if the next shipment isn't pure, I will send the Alpha Guard to supervise their excavations. It's not just the mines, Ryan. The voice was smooth, cool, and entirely composed. Sarah stepped into the vault, her crimson silk gown a sharp, bloody contrast to the gray, oppressive stone. She walked with the effortless grace of a Luna, her eyes scanning the empty shelves with a clinical detachment that bordered on disdain. The mines are failing because the entire border is destabilizing, Sarah continued, stopping beside Ryan. She reached out, her fingers brushing the dust from his palm. But the mines don't explain why our own central reserves have vanished. Corin, show the Alpha the ledger from the lower wards. Corin fumbled with the book, his fingers shaking as he flipped through the pages. He stopped at a section marked with a frayed silk ribbon and held it out for Ryan to see. These are the transfer logs from the last 6 months, Corin explained, his voice gaining a fraction of its professional clarity. High-purity stones were moved from this vault to the infirmary for specialized processing and emergency treatments. The requests were frequent, and the amounts were significant. Ryan's eyes tracked the lines of ink. The requests were all signed by the chief healer, but the inventory management, the actual tracking of the stones once they reached the lower wards, was handled by a different hand. A neat, precise script that he recognized with a jolt of cold, jagged fury. Claire. She managed the lower ward inventory, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper that didn't quite reach her eyes. The Omega you trusted with the keys to the infirmary stores. It seems she was very diligent in her record-keeping, Ryan. Perhaps too diligent. Ryan stared at the ledger. The numbers were a labyrinth of deception. Thousands of carats of high-purity moonstone had been moved to the infirmary, but the treatment logs, the actual records of what was administered to the wounded, showed only a fraction of that amount. The rest was simply missing. There was no record of where it went, no signature for its disposal. She didn't have the strength to carry that much ore, Ryan muttered, his mind racing through the possibilities. She's an Omega. She couldn't have moved crates of moonstone out of the fortress without being seen by the gate guards. She didn't need to move crates, Sarah countered, her voice sharpening. She only needed to move the refined essence. Or the powder. She spent 6 years in that infirmary, Ryan. She knew every secret passage, every shift change, every blind spot in the guard's rotation. She was invisible. Sarah's eyes glinted. While we were focused on the war and the ceremony, she was quietly hollowing us out from the inside. Sarah leaned in closer, her scent of jasmine and roses momentarily masking the smell of damp stone. Think about it, Ryan. The timing is too perfect. She disappears, and suddenly we discover our vaults are empty and our primary supply line has collapsed. She didn't just run away because of the rejection. She ran because she had finally taken enough to buy her way into a new life. Ryan felt a dark, suffocating rage boiling in his chest. He thought of the small, quiet girl who had spent her days grinding herbs and tending to the dying. He had thought she was a broken tool, a weak, useless thing that would crawl back to him within days, begging for the scraps of his mercy. but the ledger suggested a different reality. It suggested a woman who had been quietly observing the pack's vulnerabilities for years. A woman who had used her position of trust to systematically drain their most vital resource. Whether she had actually stolen it or simply allowed it to be diverted, the result was the same. Bloodclaw was crippled. She didn't just run, Ryan hissed, the words tasting like iron and bile. She betrayed the pack. And now she is in the north, Sarah added, her eyes narrowing. Vance's scouts found her trail. It leads straight toward Frosthold. If she has taken the knowledge of our supply lines or worse, the refined essence itself to Adrian, he will use it to stabilize his vanguard. He will have an army of half-turned monsters at his command while our warriors rot. Ryan turned away from the empty pedestal, his alpha aura flaring with such intensity that Corin actually whimpered, dropping the ledger onto the stone floor. The air in the vault became heavy, charged with a violent, predatory energy that made the torches flicker and die. He strode out of the vault, his mind a whirlwind of betrayal and obsessive purpose. He didn't stop until he reached the war room, where Vance was waiting by the map table, his face grim in the gray morning light. Vance, Ryan barked. Alpha, Vance said, straightening up. He looked at Ryan's face and immediately lowered his gaze. He knew that look. It was the look of a wolf who had found the scent of the prey that had dared to bite him. The tracking unit, Ryan commanded. Tell them to cross the border. Now. Vance hesitated, his hand tightening on the edge of the map table. Alpha, the border marker is more than just a line in the snow. Adrian has made it clear that any Bloodclaw warrior found on his side of the ridge will be treated as an invader. If we send a unit into Frosthold's territory, it could trigger a full-scale conflict. We are already stretched thin with the moonstone shortage and the feral activity in the south. I don't care about Adrian's markers. Ryan roared, slamming his fist onto the table. The wood groaned and cracked under the impact. He is a king of corpses and rot. He has no right to harbor a thief of Bloodclaw. He has no right to keep what belongs to me. Alpha, the risk of a two-front war. The risk is letting that Omega laugh at us from behind Adrian's walls while our pack withers. Ryan interrupted, his eyes burning with a dark, amber light. She has the secrets of our inventory. She has the timing of our supply lines. His voice dropped into something colder. I want her back, Vance. I want her back in chains, and I want every grain of moonstone she took returned to these vaults. Vance looked at the map, then back at Ryan. He saw the arrogance in the Alpha's jaw, the absolute conviction that no one, not even the king of the borderlands, could stand in his way. Ryan wasn't thinking about strategy. He was thinking about possession. Your orders, Alpha, Vance said, his voice tight with a concern he knew better than to voice again. I will send the signal. The unit will infiltrate the lower levels of Frosthold by nightfall. Tell them to be quiet, Ryan added, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. I want her taken before Adrian even knows they are there. I want her dragged back here so I can see the look on her face when she realizes she can't hide from me. He looked toward the northern horizon, where the gray peaks of the borderlands were visible through the high windows, jagged and unforgiving. If they are discovered, Ryan finished, they are to remind the borderlands why Bloodclaw is the strongest pack in the south. A pause. Bring me the Omega. Alive. I have questions that only she can answer, and I will have the truth from her, one way or another. He turned and walked out of the war room, leaving Vance to stare at the map. Ryan didn't feel the cold. He didn't feel the pre-read instability. He only felt the hunt. He would find her. He would drag her back to the tower, and he would make her watch as he rebuilt everything she had tried to destroy. She thought she could walk away. She thought she could survive without him. He would show her that there was no corner of the world dark enough to hide from the king of Bloodclaw. The lower levels of Frosthold were never quiet, but the noise usually consisted of a predictable, grim symphony, the low, ragged groans of the wounded fighting the rot, the sharp clanking of iron chains against stone walls, and the relentless dripping of condensation that pooled on the uneven floor. It was a place of suffering, but it was a suffering they understood. Today, the atmosphere in the infirmary was entirely different. It was the oppressive, suffocating silence of an impending execution. I was standing at my small workstation in the far corner, my hands mechanically grinding a fresh batch of dried willow bark. The mortar and pestle felt heavy in my fingers. Around me, the northern healers moved with tight, jerky motions. They avoided my gaze. Whenever I turned to ask for boiling water or fresh bandages, they would step back, their eyes filled with a potent mixture of fear and deeply ingrained prejudice. To them, I wasn't the healer who had saved Jax. I was a Southern Omega. I was a spy waiting for an opportunity to slit their throats. I tried to ignore the stares, focusing on the rhythm of the grinding stone. Crush. Twist. Scrape. It was the only thing keeping the rising tide of panic at bay. The heavy wooden doors of the infirmary were suddenly thrown open with such violent force that they cracked against the stone walls. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The grinding stone slipped from my fingers. I looked up. A group of border guards marched in, their faces grim, their dark armor dusted with fresh, powdery snow. They moved with absolute military precision, shoving aside two junior healers who didn't move fast enough. At their center was Mara, her expression a mask of cold, triumphant fury. Her boots thudded against the wet stone floor, her hand resting firmly on the hilt of the long dagger at her waist. She didn't look at the wounded writhing on their cots. She marched straight toward my workstation. "Step away from the table, Omega," Mara commanded. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the damp air with lethal clarity. I froze, my heart giving a sudden, painful lurch against my ribs. The guards fanned out quickly, forming a tight semicircle around my corner, their hands resting on the triggers of their crossbows or the pommels of their swords. The entire infirmary fell dead silent. Even the wounded seemed to stop breathing. "What is this?" I asked, forcing myself to stand tall, though I could feel a slight tremor starting in my knees. "This is the end of your little charade," Mara sneered, stepping close enough that I could smell the harsh scent of pine and freezing wind clinging to her cloak. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed it onto the wooden table in front of me. It landed with a dull, heavy thud, scattering the carefully powdered willow bark across the wood. It was a heavy silver medallion, deeply tarnished and scratched. But even beneath the grime and the scoring, the crest stamped into the center of the metal was unmistakable. A wolf's head, jaws open wide, a jagged crescent moon caught between its fangs. The crest of Bloodclaw. "My scouts found this 3 miles from the southern gate," Mara said, her voice carrying across the silent infirmary, ensuring every healer and guard heard the accusation. "Tied to a branch of a dead pine, right on the main patrol route. It wasn't dropped by accident in the snow. It was deliberately placed there. A marker." I stared at the medallion, a cold, paralyzing dread settling in the pit of my stomach. Bloodclaw. Ryan. They had found the trail. The King of the South had sent trackers into the borderlands. "I didn't put that there," I said, tearing my eyes away from the silver crest and looking directly at Mara. "I haven't left the lower levels since I arrived. You know that. Your guards have watched my every move." "You didn't have to leave the fortress," Mara countered, taking another step forward, invading my space. "You just had to leave a trail for them to follow before you got here. You reek of the South, Omega. You think we didn't notice the lingering scent of your alpha on you? You think we didn't know exactly what you were the moment you crossed our borders? A spy?" I repeated, the sheer absurdity of the accusation momentarily overriding my terror. "I was exiled. I was thrown out of Bloodclaw to die in the snow. Why would I lead them here? Why would I help the pack that discarded me?" "Because you're a loyal little dog," Mara spat, the venom in her voice raw and unfiltered. "Because Southern Omegas are bred to be submissive. You thought you could infiltrate Frosthold, find our weaknesses, the rot in our vanguard, the layout of our defenses, and hand us over to Ryan on a silver platter. You thought you could buy your way back into his bed with our blood." The words were a brutal slap in the face. They were a cruel, jagged reminder of the life I had left behind, the weakness I had fought so hard to overcome. But more than that, they were a death sentence. In the borderlands, under Adrian's rule, spies were not interrogated or imprisoned. They were executed. Publicly. "She's lying." The voice was a harsh, agonizing rasp that echoed from the shadows of the confinement area. The guards instantly turned, their crossbows raising with military precision. Jax was sitting on the edge of his cot behind the thick silver bars. He looked terrible. His skin was the color of dirty snow, his muscles trembling violently under his sweat-soaked bandages. But his single golden eye was sharp, burning with a fierce, defiant light. He gripped the silver bars with his good hand, his knuckles turning white, and tried to stand. His legs buckled almost immediately, but he forced himself upright, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. Two of Mara's guards immediately stepped forward, leveling their weapons directly at his chest. "Stay down, Vanguard," one of the guards warned, his finger tightening on the trigger mechanism. "This doesn't concern you. The Alpha's orders are clear." "It concerns me when you accuse the healer who saved my life of treason," Jax growled, his voice vibrating with a deep, territorial resonance that made the guards flinch. He leaned heavily against the bars, his chest heaving. "If she was a spy, she would have let me turn. She would have let the rot take the vanguard. I would have slaughtered half this infirmary before you could put me down. That's what a spy would do." "She saved you to gain our trust," Mara argued, turning her furious gaze on Jax. "It's a classic infiltration tactic. She makes herself indispensable. She plays the miracle worker. And then, when we drop our guard, she opens the gates for Bloodclaw." "She didn't open any gates," Jax countered, spitting blood onto the stone floor. "She has been locked in this dungeon for 3 days, bleeding herself dry to keep me sane. Look at her, Mara. Does she look like a Vanguard infiltrator?" "Enough." The single word wasn't shouted. It was spoken with a low, conversational tone, but it cut through the argument like a heavy broadsword severing a limb. The crowd of healers and guards parted instantly, scrambling backward, their heads bowing in absolute deference. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. Adrian walked into the infirmary. His presence sucked the air out of the room. He was dressed in his full battle armor, the dark steel plates absorbing the dim torchlight rather than reflecting it. His heavy wolf fur cloak swept the stone floor behind him. He didn't look at Jax. He didn't look at Mara or the medallion on the table. He looked at me. His golden eyes were unreadable, a cold, calculating void that offered no comfort, no recognition of what I had done for his pack, and absolutely no mercy. He was the king of the north. And he was looking at an enemy. "Bring her to the courtyard," Adrian commanded, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Adrian," Jax started, his voice cracking with desperation. He hit the silver bars with his fist. "Adrian, listen to me." Adrian finally turned his head, his expression hardening into something terrifying. "You are a Vanguard, Jax. Not a judge. Return to your cot before you tear your stitches and bleed out on my floor." He didn't wait for Jax's response. He turned and walked out of the infirmary, the heavy doors remaining open in his wake. The guards didn't hesitate. 2 of them lunged forward, grabbing my arms. Their grips were brutal, their armored gauntlets biting deep into my skin as they hauled me away from the workstation. I didn't fight them. I knew it was useless. I looked back at Jax as they dragged me toward the door. He was slumped against the bars, sliding slowly down to the floor, his golden eye burning with helpless, furious frustration. They dragged me up the winding stone stairs, out of the damp, suffocating heat of the lower levels. Every step felt like walking toward a guillotine. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, a frantic, terrified rhythm. We emerged into the freezing, biting air of the main courtyard. The blizzard had stopped, but the wind was still howling through the mountain peaks, whipping the loose snow into blinding white vortexes. The courtyard was packed. Hundreds of warriors stood in disciplined ranks, their faces grim and hard, their breath pluming in the freezing air like smoke from a battlefield. They formed a wide circle, leaving a large, terrifyingly empty space in the center. As I was dragged through the crowd, I could feel their hatred. It radiated from them in waves. They muttered curses in the northern dialect, their eyes tracking me like wolves watching a wounded deer. The guards threw me into the center of the circle. I hit the hard, packed snow, my knees scraping against the hidden ice beneath. The cold immediately soaked through my thin tunic, biting into my skin like hundreds of tiny needles. I didn't stay down. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the stinging pain, and pushed myself up. My breath came in short, painful gasps, forming white clouds in the air. Adrian stood at the edge of the circle, his massive frame silhouetted against the gray sky. His right hand rested casually on the hilt of his massive broadsword. Mara stood beside him, holding the tarnished Bloodclaw medallion up for the crowd to see. "The evidence is clear, Alpha," Mara called out, her voice easily carrying over the howling wind. "The southern pack is at our borders. They followed her scent. They followed her markers. She is a liability we cannot afford." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. It was a dark, hungry sound. They were exhausted from the endless war against the ferals. They were terrified of the rot. They needed an enemy they could see, an enemy they could kill and be done with. And I was the perfect target. Adrian didn't speak immediately. He stepped forward, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the frozen snow. He walked slowly, deliberately, the crowd falling into a breathless silence as he approached. He stopped just 3 feet away from me. He looked down at me, his golden eyes searching my face. He was looking for fear. He was looking for a confession. He was looking for the weak, submissive Omega that Mara claimed I was. I didn't give him any of it. I stood as tall as I could, ignoring the violent shivering of my body, and locked my eyes onto his. I was terrified. My pulse was a frantic drumbeat in my ears. But I refused to let him see it. I was Claire. I had survived the severance of a mate bond. I had survived the exile. I would not die cowering in the snow for a crime I didn't commit. Adrian held my gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, he drew his sword. The sound of the dark steel sliding from its scabbard was a sharp, metallic hiss that seemed to cut through the wind itself. The blade was massive, forged from heavy, black iron, the edge gleaming with lethal, silver light. He raised the sword with effortless strength. The tip moved through the air with deadly grace, stopping exactly 1 inch from the hollow of my throat. I could feel the cold radiating from the metal, a physical manifestation of his intent. "You have one chance, Omega," Adrian said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated deep in my chest. "Give me a reason not to take your head." The tip of the broadsword was inches from my skin. I could feel the cold radiating from the dark steel, a physical manifestation of the king's lethal intent. I could see the reflection of my own pale, terrified face in the polished metal, distorted by the curve of the blade. The courtyard was dead silent. Hundreds of warriors watched, their breaths pluming in the freezing air, waiting for the execution. They were tired. They were cold. They were terrified of the rot. They needed an enemy they could see, an enemy they could kill. And I was the perfect target. I had to think. I had to find a way out of this. I looked past the sword, past Adrian's cold, unyielding eyes, and focused on the medallion in Mara's hand. "May I see the medallion?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Mara sneered, her grip tightening on the silver crest. "You want to say goodbye to your Alpha S mark before you die?" "Give it to her," Adrian commanded, not moving the sword a fraction of an inch. Mara hesitated, her jaw clenching, but she didn't dare disobey. She stepped forward and tossed the medallion into the snow at my feet. I didn't break eye contact with Adrian as I slowly knelt down and picked it up. The metal was freezing, the edges sharp and jagged. I turned it over in my hands, examining the scratches, the tarnish, and the small, frayed piece of leather cord still attached to the top. I brought it closer to my face, closing my eyes and taking a deep breath. The scent of old silver and dried sweat was there, but beneath it, faint but unmistakable, was something else. Something metallic and sour. The scent of old blood. "This medallion wasn't dropped by a tracker," I said, opening my eyes and looking up at Adrian. "It was tied to a branch," Mara snapped, stepping forward again, her hand resting on the hilt of her dagger. "I told you that. It was a marker." "I know," I said, standing up slowly, the tip of Adrian's sword following my movement perfectly, never leaving the hollow of my throat. "But it wasn't tied there recently. Look at the leather cord." I held the medallion up, pointing to the frayed knot. "It's stiff. Frozen solid. It's been exposed to the elements for weeks, not days. A tracker moving quickly through the snow wouldn't leave a marker that looks like it's been buried in a blizzard for a month." "The weather in the borderlands is unpredictable," Mara argued, her voice losing a fraction of its confidence. "It could have frozen overnight." "Maybe," I conceded, my voice hardening. "But the weather didn't do this." I turned the medallion over, pointing to the deep, jagged scratches on the surface of the silver. "These marks. They aren't from a weapon. They aren't from being dropped on the rocks." I looked up. "They're from teeth. Feral teeth." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. The warriors shifted uneasily, their eyes darting toward the heavy iron gates of the fortress. The word feral was enough to send a chill through even the most hardened veteran. This medallion belonged to a Bloodclaw patrol that was ambushed near the border a month ago, I continued, my voice carrying over the howling wind. Ryan sent them to scout the outer ridges, and they never came back. I treated the only survivor before he died. He told me they lost their crests in the attack. The ferals took them. I looked directly at Adrian, ignoring the sword at my throat. Your scouts didn't find a tracker S marker. They found a feral S trophy. The ferals are moving closer to the gates, and they're leaving the bones of their kills behind to mark their territory. Adrian stared at me, his golden eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't lower the sword. A clever story, Adrian said softly, his voice a dangerous rumble that vibrated in my chest. But it doesn't prove you aren't a spy. It only proves you know how to read a piece of silver. If I were a spy, I said, taking a half step forward. The tip of the sword pressed lightly against the skin of my throat, a sharp prick of pain warning me not to move any further. I wouldn't have saved Jax. I would have let him turn. I would have let him tear through your lower levels and slaughter your healers. I would have let the rot consume your vanguard. You saved him to gain our trust, Mara shouted, desperate to regain control of the narrative. Alpha, she is manipulating you. She is a Southern Omega. She belongs to Bloodclaw. I saved him because I am a healer, I said, my eyes locked onto Adrian S., refusing to look away. And because I know what the rot does when it's left unchecked. I lowered my voice, speaking so quietly that only Adrian could hear me over the howling wind. I know how it starts, I whispered, my gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to his right hand, the hand gripping the massive broadsword. I know how it hides in the marrow. My eyes returned to his. And I know that if you don't lower this sword, the tremor in your wrist is going to become visible to every warrior in this courtyard. Adrian froze. It was a microscopic reaction, a sudden, absolute stillness that lasted for less than a second, but I saw it. I saw the slight widening of his pupils, the sudden, sharp intake of breath. I saw the microscopic tightening of his knuckles as he fought to suppress the jagged, unnatural vibration in his muscles. I had gambled everything on Jax's observation. And I had won. Adrian stared at me, the cold, calculating void in his eyes replaced by something far more dangerous. It was the look of a king who had just realized that his deepest, darkest secret was known by the one person he couldn't afford to kill. If he killed me now, he would lose the only healer who had successfully pulled a vanguard back from the brink of full feral transformation. He would lose his only chance at surviving the rot that was slowly eating him alive. Slowly, deliberately, Adrian lowered the sword. He didn't sheath it. He held it at his side, the tip resting in the snow. He reached out with his free hand and snatched the Bloodclaw medallion from my fingers. He didn't look at it. He simply crushed it. The heavy silver warped and buckled under the sheer, terrifying force of his alpha grip. He dropped the mangled piece of metal into the snow, burying it beneath his heavy boot. He turned to face the crowd, his alpha aura flaring. It wasn't the chaotic, unstable energy of Ryan pre-rut. It was a heavy, suffocating pressure, cold and absolute, like the weight of a glacier. The murmuring warriors fell into instant, terrified silence. The Omega S assessment is correct, Adrian announced, his voice ringing across the courtyard with unquestionable authority. The medallion is old. It is a feral trophy, not a tracker S mark. Mara stepped forward, her face pale with shock. Alpha, you cannot be serious. She is a Southern. She is a provisional field healer, Adrian interrupted, his voice cutting her off like a physical blow. She is not one of us. But tonight, she kept my vanguard breathing. That is enough to keep her alive. He looked around the circle, his golden eyes daring anyone to challenge his decree. No one moved. No one spoke. The resentment was still there, burning in their eyes, but their fear of the Alpha was stronger. She is under my protection, Adrian continued, his voice dropping to a lethal register. Anyone who questions this verdict questions my judgment. Anyone who touches her answers to my sword. He turned back to me. The public declaration of protection was over. The private warning was just beginning. Return to the infirmary, healer, Adrian commanded, his eyes burning with a cold, silent promise that our conversation was far from over. You have work to do. He didn't wait for my response. He turned and walked away, his heavy fur cloak sweeping the snow, the crowd parting for him like water. I stood in the center of the courtyard, the freezing wind whipping my hair around my face. I had survived the accusation. I had secured a temporary place in Frosthold. But as I looked at the faces of the warriors around me, the suspicion, the resentment, the lingering hatred for the South, I knew that Adrian's protection was a fragile shield. I was still an outsider. I was still the enemy. I turned and began the long walk back toward the lower levels. I didn't look at Mara, though I could feel her furious glare burning into my back. As I reached the heavy wooden doors of the keep, I paused, looking back out over the courtyard. Near the entrance to the lower levels, supported by one of the guards near a stone pillar, was Jax. He was too weak to stand on his own, his weight dragging against the guard's shoulder, his face gray with exhaustion, but his golden eye was fixed on me. He gave a slow, barely perceptible nod before turning and limping back down into the darkness. He had tried to defend me, even when he could barely stand. It was a debt I wouldn't forget. I pulled the heavy wooden doors open and stepped back into the dark, suffocating heat of the lower levels. The verdict had been delivered, but the war had only just begun. Miles away, hidden by the howling wind and the blinding snow, the first scouts of the Bloodclaw tracking unit officially crossed the border marker. They moved silently, their scents masked by ghost leaf, their eyes fixed on the dark peaks of Frosthold. The king of the south had sent his hunters. And the king of the north was rotting from the inside out. I was trapped between them, armed with nothing but a few silver needles and a ring that tasted of ancient moonlight. The heavy wooden doors of the keep groaned as I pushed them open, the sound echoing through the damp, lightless shaft of the lower levels. The transition from the freezing, open courtyard to the suffocating, humid heat of the infirmary was like stepping into the throat of a beast. It wasn't just the heat. It was the weight of the air, thick with the sense of old blood, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, metallic tang of the rot that no amount of vinegar could scrub away. In the north, the rot didn't just smell like decay. It smelled like electricity and rust, a jagged, unnatural scent that set my teeth on edge. As I walked down the central aisle, the atmosphere had shifted. The open hostility of the previous hour had curdled into something colder, sharper. The junior healers, who used to ignore me or shove past me with a sneer, now froze when I approached. They didn't bow. Southern Omegas didn't receive bows in Frosthold. But they stepped back, their eyes wide with a mixture of suspicion and a new, jagged kind of fear. I wasn't just the southern exile anymore. I was the woman who had held a knife to the king's secret and lived. I was a variable they didn't know how to calculate, and in a place as rigid as Frosthold, an uncalculated variable was a threat. Stop right there, Omega. Mara stepped out from the shadows near the supply cabinet. Her face was still pale from the confrontation in the courtyard, her eyes burning with a humiliated fury that made the air around her feel like it was vibrating. She didn't have the broad store's key I had hoped for. Instead, she held a smaller, rusted iron key on a thin leather cord, which she dangled before me like a taunt. Beside her stood two of her senior assistants, Bryn and Calla, both holding thick parchment ledgers and charcoal sticks. They didn't look at me. They looked at my hands, their expressions set in masks of disciplined resentment. They were the watchdogs, the human walls built to ensure I remained a prisoner even while I worked. The Alpha has decreed you be allowed to work, Mara said, her voice sounding like it was being dragged over broken glass. But the primary stores remain under my lock. You will have access to the secondary treatment cabinet and nothing more. Every grain of moonstone slag, every drop of thistle extract you draw, will be witnessed and recorded by Bryn or Calla. You will sign for every milligram. Her eyes hardened. If a single grain is unaccounted for, I will personally see you dragged back to that courtyard, and this time, the Alpha's sword 1T stop at your throat. She tossed the key. I caught it, the cold iron biting into my palm. I'm not here to steal your scraps, Mara. I'm here to stop your men from turning. If you want to play bookkeeper while the vanguard rots, that's your choice. You're here because you've made yourself a necessary evil, Mara spat. Witness her, Bryn. Record every breath she takes. I ignored the two shadows trailing me and headed straight for the treatment cabinet. It was a massive, iron-bound piece of furniture that smelled of cedar and rot. Inside, the organization was a disaster. Vials were mislabeled, and the moonstone slag was little more than gray dust, stripped of the vibrant, silver resonance found in the south. It was the waste product of the mining process, the stuff they usually threw to the ferals to keep them at bay. I turned toward the ward, my eyes scanning the rows of cots. The chaos was overwhelming. Triage first, I muttered to myself. What was that? Bryn snapped, her charcoal stick poised over the ledger. Speak clearly, Omega. The records must be precise. I said removing the patients, I said, louder this time, my voice echoing through the vaulted room. This ward is a breeding ground for cross-contamination. The warriors whose black veins have reached their chests need to be moved to the isolation cells near the back immediately. Those with limb-only symptoms stay in the central aisle where we can monitor the progression. And we need fresh straw. Now. You can't just move the vanguard, Kala protested, her face reddening. They are warriors, not cattle to be sorted. They deserve to be among their brothers. They are dying, I snapped, turning to face her. I stepped close, forcing her to look at the bloodstains on my tunic. And if you keep them all mixed together, the ones we could save will be torn apart by the ones who turn in the middle of the night. Their brothers won't recognize them when the madness takes hold. Move them, or I will go back up those stairs and tell Adrian that his senior healers are prioritizing pack tradition over the survival of his army. The mention of the king's name worked like a physical blow. With visible reluctance and a stream of whispered curses in the northern dialect, they began to signal the guards to assist with the relocation. I moved to the first cot in the savable row. A young warrior named Eric lay there, his face a mask of agony. He was barely 20, his wolf spirit still young and volatile. His right leg was exposed, the skin from the knee down a mottled, sickly purple, shot through with thick, oily black veins that seemed to writhe beneath the surface. The wound at his calf was a jagged tear, weeping a dark, foul-smelling fluid that smelled of ozone and swamp water. Witness, I said to Bryn, who stepped closer, her nose wrinkling in disgust. I drew a small bowl and a silver debriding knife. Taking 30 milliliters of vinegar wash and 5 grams of salt crust. Bryn scribbled furiously, her eyes darting between the bowl and the ledger. I began the work. It was brutal. I had to scrape away the necrotic tissue, the black rot clinging to the muscle like parasitic vines. Eric groaned, a low, predatory sound that vibrated in his chest, his eyes flickering toward that milky, feral white. His claws extended, raking the side of the wooden cot, leaving deep gouges in the oak. Hold him, I commanded a junior healer nearby. Once the wound was raw and bleeding fresh, red blood, I prepared the poultice. I reached for the moonstone slag and the silver thistle extract. 3 grams of slag. 2 drops of thistle, I announced. I mixed them, the paste turning a pale, shimmering blue. I applied it to the wound, expecting the immediate cooling effect I had seen in the south. For a moment, Eric's breathing smoothed. But then his body suddenly convulsed. The black veins in his leg didn't dull. They flared with a violent, angry light, and the blue paste turned a putrid, bubbling yellow. Eric let out a sharp, agonized shriek, his body arching off the cot, his jaw snapping at the air. It's failing. Kala hissed, a note of triumph hidden beneath her faint concern. You're killing him, Omega. Your southern tricks are poison here. My heart hammered against my ribs. Think, Claire. The northern constitution is denser, the wolf spirit more aggressive. The resonance isn't penetrating. The southern ratio was too weak. The thistle was aggravating the rot because there wasn't enough moonstone resonance to anchor it. The slag was dormant. Cold. Wipe it off. I shouted, grabbing a clean cloth. Quickly, before the reaction hits his femoral artery. I scrubbed the wound clean as Eric thrashed, his blood splattering my face. My hands were shaking, but I forced them still. I looked at the gray dust in the jar. It needed a catalyst. In the south, the sun did the work. Here, there was no sun. Draw another 5 grams of slag, I said, my voice steady despite the panic. And this time, bring me a candle. And a small iron ladle. A candle? For what? Bryn questioned, but she recorded the request. I held the small iron ladle over the flame, warming the moonstone dust until it began to give off a faint, ozonic scent, the gray particles starting to vibrate with a microscopic shimmer. Then I tripled the ratio 15 grams of warmed slag to 2 drops of thistle. Applying the second batch, I said. As the warm paste touched the raw tissue, the reaction was immediate. The angry light in the veins died down instantly. The black lines didn't disappear, but they stopped their frantic pulsing, settling into a dull, dormant state. Eric's body went limp, the tension leaving his muscles as his breathing shifted from a frantic pant to a deep, restorative rhythm. Witness, I whispered, my voice thick with relief. Bryn stared at the wound, her charcoal stick frozen. She looked at the ledger, then back at the warrior who was no longer trying to slaughter everyone in the room. Stable, she muttered, recording the word with a hand that was visibly trembling. I stood up, my back aching. I had been in the ward for hours, and this was only the first patient. I looked toward the confinement area at the edge of the ward. Jax was there, slumped against the silver bars of his cell. He looked terrible, worse than he had in the courtyard. His skin was the color of old parchment, and a dark smear of blood stained the corner of his mouth. He was leaning heavily against the bars, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches that suggested the rot was still clawing at his lungs. You're making quite a mess, little bird, Jax rasped, followed by a violent, racking cough that left him gasping for air. He spat a thick glob of dark, clotted blood onto the stone floor, his body shuddering with the effort of staying upright. I'm fixing the mess your people made, I said, walking over and sliding a cup of water with a trace of willow bark and mountain mint through the bars. He took the cup with a hand that shook so violently the water nearly spilled. He drank greedily, then leaned his head back against the cold stone, his single golden eye clouded with a haze of pain. Mara, one tea, let this stand, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the groans of the other wounded. You're showing them that her ways are failing. In Frosthold, that's a more dangerous thing to do than stabbing the king. I don't care about Mara's ego, I said, looking back at Eric. I care about the fact that he is breathing. I spent the next several hours repeating the process, moving down the line of cots. Each time, I had to adjust the heat and the ratio, accounting for the depth of the rot and the strength of the warrior's spirit. Bryn and Calla recorded every movement, every grain of dust, their presence a constant, suffocating reminder of my precarious position. They were looking for a reason to stop me, to find the one mistake that would justify Mara's hatred. 5 milligrams of slag used, Bryn would drone. 2 drops of extract. 3 clean linen strips. 1 candle consumed. By the time the first hint of gray light filtered through the high, barred windows of the upper keep, I was covered in the filth of the ward, my mind a blur of ratios and symptoms. My eyes were burning, my vision tunneling with exhaustion. Every muscle in my body screamed for rest, but the list of wounded seemed to grow longer with every hour. But the silence in the room had changed. It was no longer the oppressive, terrified silence of a graveyard. It was the silence of a pack that had been given a single, fragile second of breathing room. For the first time in weeks, the lower levels didn't sound like a slaughterhouse. I sat on a small wooden stool near the medicine cabinet, my head bowing as sleep finally began to pull at me. The shadows of the room seemed to dance, the flickering torches casting long, distorted shapes against the stone walls. Omega. Bryn was standing over me, her ledger finally closed. Her expression was unreadable, but for the first time, the naked hostility in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, unsettling confusion. She looked at Eric, then back at me. The Alpha requires a report on the slag consumption by dawn, she said, her voice stiff and formal. Stay here. Do not touch the cabinet while I am gone. Calla will remain to watch you. I didn't answer. I just watched her walk away, her boots echoing on the stone. I had bought Eric a night. I had bought myself a night. But as I looked at the dwindling jar of moonstone slag, the gray dust shimmering weakly in the torchlight, I knew the real war hadn't even begun. The rot wasn't just in the blood. It was in the mountain itself. And I was trying to hold back a tide with a handful of sand. The morning in the lower levels didn't arrive with sunlight. It arrived with the smell of scorched sage and the low, rhythmic thud of the changing guard in the corridors above, a sound that vibrated through the stone floor and into my very bones. I woke with my head resting against the cold stone wall, my neck stiff and my fingers cramped from a night of gripping silver debriding knives and stone pestles. My first instinct, even before my eyes fully opened, was to check the row of cots I had worked on through the night. Eric, the young warrior whose leg had been nearly black and pulsing with a violent, oily light, was still asleep. His chest moved with a slow, even cadence that I hadn't seen in this infirmary since I arrived. I stood up, my joints popping with loud, dry cracks, and carefully peeled back the edge of the linen bandage. The black veins were still there, frozen like ink trapped under ice. They hadn't retreated, the rot was too deep for that, already claimed by the marrow, but they hadn't moved an inch toward his heart. The skin around the wound was no longer fever hot. It was cool. Almost normal. The putrid, yellow reaction from my first failed attempt had been replaced by a clean, shimmering blue seal. He was breathing. He was stable. In the north, where the rot usually claimed a limb in hours and a life in days, this was a quiet miracle. I felt a presence behind me and turned. A small group of junior healers, the ones Bryn and Kala usually relegated to the most menial floor scrubbing and linen boiling duties, had gathered a few feet away. They were watching me with a mixture of bafflement and reluctant, wide-eyed awe. They looked like pups who had seen a ghost, their faces pale in the flickering torchlight. "His fever is gone," one of them, a girl named Ellen with soot-smudged cheeks and tired eyes, whispered. "I checked him an hour ago while you were nodding off." I thought he had passed, he was so still. But his pulse is steady. The low, predatory growl that has been in his chest since the full moon, it stopped. "He's resting," I said, my voice raspy from sleep and the dry, smoky air. "His wolf spirit is no longer fighting the infection because the infection is no longer spreading. It's dormant. The moonstone resonance has convinced the wolf that the rot is a part of its own shell, so it has stopped attacking itself." I walked over to the medicine prep table, where a fresh batch of moonstone slag and silver thistle sat waiting. My shadows, Bryn and Kala, were busy at the other end of the ward, but they were watching. I didn't care. "Come here," I commanded. They hesitated, looking toward the shadows where Mara usually lurked, but Ellen stepped forward first, followed by two others. They approached the table as if it were an altar, their hands tucked into their aprons. "If you want to save the men in the next row, you need to learn this," I said, picking up a heavy stone mortar. "The moonstone slag you're using is low-grade waste. In the south, we wouldn't use this for a dog's scratch. If you just mix it cold, the resonance is too weak to bind the corruption. You have to grind it until it's like silk, until the individual particles are too small for the eye to see." I demonstrated the technique, the rhythmic scrape of the pestle against the stone filling the quiet ward. "Watch the pressure. You're not crushing grain, you're polishing the stone's spirit. Light, circular motions. And then, you have to warm it, not burn it, just warm it until it smells like the air before a mountain storm. That ozonic scent? That's the resonance waking up." I let Ellen take the pestle. She was nervous, her hands shaking, but she followed my instructions. I watched her correct the pressure when the powder became too clumped, her eyes focusing with a new kind of intensity. "Steady," I corrected, placing my hand over hers. "Feel the stone. If it feels gritty, it's not ready. If it feels like it's vibrating under your palm, that's when you add the thistle extract slowly, drop by drop. The thistle is the bridge. It carries the moonstone's light into the deep tissue, but if you add too much, the bridge collapses and the rot flows right through." "Why did nobody tell us this?" Ellen asked, her voice small, her eyes fixed on the shimmering violet powder. "Elder Mara says the thistle must be boiled for 3 hours to strip its toxicity." "Because your elders were too busy trying to burn the rot out," I said. "They forgot that the rot is a part of the wolf now. Boiling the thistle kills its pull. You don't fight the rot with fire, Ellen, you trap it in a cage of moonlight. Containment is not a cure, Omega. It is a delay of the inevitable." Mara's voice cut through the ward like a whip, snapping the fragile moment of learning. She was standing at the edge of the supply area, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the ledger Bryn was presenting to her with a look of mounting horror. "You've used half of our secondary moonstone reserves in a single night," Mara said, marching toward us, her boots clicking sharply on the stone. 3 times the standard allocation for Eric alone. You are depleting the very lifelines of this pack for a handful of stable patients who will likely turn the moment you stop the treatments. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to secure even this slag from the lower pits? They aren't experiments, Mara, I said, standing to face her. I didn't back down. They are your vanguard. And the reason I'm using so much is because the standard allocation was designed for southern packs with high purity stones, not for the absolute corruption that is eating this mountain. Your medicine was failing because you were being stingy with a dying flame. It is a waste, Mara insisted, her face reddening. We have dozens more wounded arriving from the outer ridges every day. If we follow your ratios, we will be out of moonstone slag before the week is out. The Alpha cannot afford to let his warriors become dependent on a southern crutch that we cannot sustain. What happens when the jars are empty, Omega? Do they all turn at once? Then find more moonstone, I countered. The vaults are empty because your mines are failing, not because I'm using too much medicine. If you want to save your pack, you need to fix the source, not blame the healer who's keeping your warriors from tearing your throat out. The ward went dead silent. Even the wounded seemed to stop their groaning. The junior healers stepped back into the shadows, their eyes darting between us in terrified silence. Mara stepped into my personal space, her scent turning sharp and aggressive, a cold, biting wind of musk and ancient anger. Be careful, Southern. You speak of things you do not understand. The Alpha's protection only extends as long as you are a solution. If you become a drain on our survival, a leak in our most precious resource, you are a liability. And liabilities in Frosthold are cut away without hesitation. She turned to the junior healers, her gaze lethal. Back to your duties. Scrub the floors. Boil the linens. If I see anyone else wasting time on silk grinding, you'll be assigned to the burial details at the base of the cliff. Do you understand? The girls scrambled away, their brief moment of hope crushed under the weight of Mara's authority. She gave me one final, hateful look before disappearing into the upper corridors. I returned to the prep table, my heart hammering against my ribs. She was right about one thing: the resources were dwindling. My stabilization was a temporary bandage on a gaping, infected wound. We were running out of time, and the mountain was running out of light. I walked over to the confinement area. Jax was leaning his head against a stone pillar near the edge of his cell, his weight dragging against the guard's shoulder who was helping him back from the latrine. He looked like a ghost of the man who had dragged me from the snow. His muscles had wasted away, and his single eye was clouded with a haze of permanent pain. You're pushing her too hard, Jax rasped, his voice a dry, hollow rattle. He leaned heavily against the bars as the guard stepped away. She's letting them die because she's afraid of an empty jar, I said, handing him a clean cloth to wipe the gray sweat from his brow. Jax took the cloth, his single golden eye fixing on me with a strange, dark intensity. She's afraid because she knows what's coming, Claire. She knows the moonstones aren't just dying. They're being poisoned from the root. Poisoned? I repeated, keeping my voice low. By the rot? Does it reach that deep? Adrian knows more than he says, Jax whispered, his breath hitching. He spends more time in the war room looking at maps of the deep veins than he does looking at his pack. Watch his sword hand when the Black Hollow mine is mentioned. Watch the way he looks at the gray dust in your jars, as if he's looking at his own grave. No one stands that close to the heart of the North for years and walks away clean. The implication made my blood run cold. If the mountain itself was poisoned, and Adrian was the one holding the line. How long has the king been like this? I asked. Longer than I've been in the vanguard, Jax said, his voice fading to a thread. He's the only thing keeping the mountain from screaming. But your southern medicine, it's like trying to put out a forest fire with a cup of water. It won't be enough when the north vein finally breaks. Then we have to go to the source, I said. If the vein is the problem, I need to see it. I need to know what's poisoning the stones. Jax let out a dry, hacking laugh that turned into a violent cough. You go to the source, and the source will eat you. Adrian won't let you near it. You're too valuable as a bandage to risk on the truth. Before I could press him for more, the heavy doors at the top of the stairs opened with a thunderous boom. A group of elite guards, Adrian's personal guard, the ones with the silver wolf crests, marched in, their black armor clanking with grim, military precision. They marched straight toward me, their presence a cold shadow in the warm ward. Omega, the lead guard announced, his voice echoing in the vaulted ceiling. The Alpha requires your presence in the war room. Immediately. Leave your tools. You are to come as you are. I looked at Jax, who gave a slow, grim nod, his eye closing as he slumped back against the pillar. I wiped my hands on my apron, the scent of moonstone, blood, and the ozone of awakened stone clinging to my skin like a second soul. I followed the guards out of the ward, past the silent, watching eyes of the healers and the warriors who were still breathing because of me. As the iron doors closed behind me, the cold, stale air of the keep felt even more oppressive. I was being pulled out of the relative safety of the infirmary and into the heart of the North's secrets. Adrian was done waiting for reports. He was ready for a verdict, and I was the only one left who could deliver it.